It's a cold night in Michigan on January 12, 2010. 20-something Michelle Romaine is at home with her two other grown siblings, and since it's after 9, things in the house are kind of like winding down for the night. They're just waiting for their mom to get home before they fully lock up and call it a night. Now, you see, earlier their mom, Joanne, had dropped her son off, Michael, and then went to go get gas. And that was a couple of hours ago, but they figured she probably went to church, maybe she ran some errands, whatever. So when Michelle sees headlights in the front window, she assumes that it's her mom. But when she peeks out of the window, her heart sinks because it's actually the police. When she opens the door, Michelle's fears only grow because according to what she told producers of Unsolved Mysteries for an episode called Lady in the Lake, the officer immediately confronts her with some troubling news. He says that they found her mom's car abandoned in the church parking lot, and he asks Michelle if her mom is missing. Now, what was fear turns a bit into confusion. No, they hadn't reported their mom missing. They had just seen her, a couple of hours ago? And Michelle's sister is paying attention to what's going on by now, and she looks down at her phone. It is 9:24. She knows that Joanne dropped her youngest Michael off at home at 6, so it's been like 3.5 hours.
Ashley, is this the first story we've ever covered that the police are actually so on top of everything that they know someone is missing before the family even does?
Maybe, but there's actually something else confusing to Michelle. So the car that they found in this church parking lot, it's a silver Lexus that her mom was driving that night. You see, that car is registered to Michelle. So she's wondering, how did police know to come looking for Joanne? Shouldn't they have been...
Right, they should be looking for her.
Right. Now, in that moment, it didn't matter too much to Michelle. She knew that her mom was driving the car that night and her mom wasn't home, so she needed to figure out what was going on. So she and her sister, along with their Uncle John, all got together and drove to the church where Joanne's car was parked. Now, they probably expected to see a pretty empty parking lot. You know, Joanne's car for sure, maybe a cop car next to it with an officer who ran the plates, if that would. Because, what's the officer going to do just hanging around it? But when they pull up, it's a little bit after 10 p.m., and what they actually saw made all of their jaws drop to the floor, where it was a full-on crime scene. We're talking taped off, officers crawling all over the place, literally helicopters in the air searching Lake St. Clair across the street from the church. It was unreal.
Oh, wait, what am I missing? I mean, we've covered hundreds of stories now, and in nearly every single one, the police are telling the family they have to wait, 24, 48, sometimes 72 hours to even report a loved one missing. And in Michigan, they have helicopters out within, 3 hours?
Well, police on the scene are telling Michelle that there's a reason for the urgency. They have a reason to believe that Joanne took her own life, they say. And they're telling them all of this is not searching for a missing person. This is a rescue effort.
Okay, but how do they know that? They can't have taken, a mental history on her at this point.
No, they don't. And honestly, a mental history wouldn't have led them to this conclusion. Joanne had no history of depression or any mental illnesses. What police say is that when the officer came across her abandoned car and ran the plates or whatever, he noticed that there was also a purse still inside. But more concerning, he saw footprints in the snow, small, high-heeled prints leading from the car out to the lake. And when he followed the prints right up to the water, he then saw this area where it looked like someone had kind of sat down and slid down this concrete wall to the next level, slid down again, right into the water. So they were convinced then and there that Joanne had gone into the water and they needed to find her. And I'm sure everyone thought they stood a good chance. The water was super shallow. Literally, Joanne would have had to walk almost 2 football fields out into the water before the water even came above her less than 5-foot frame. And the water's pretty clear. Joanne was wearing all black that night, so against the icy blue, she should stand out. But more than anything, a lot of the lake was frozen over, so they should be able to look for holes or disturbances in the ice, and that should be a dead giveaway. So along with the helicopters, police brought in water search and rescue teams, and for the next several hours, they looked and looked and looked, but there wasn't a single sign of Joanne. Not even one additional clue. So by 4 a.m., the helicopters were called off and Joanne's car was towed to the police station for processing. Now, the family's natural reaction is, well, what now? Because, in their minds, she clearly didn't go into the lake like police originally thought. So then what happened to her? maybe someone else was involved. But they say that there was no real next move from the police. They stuck to their guns. She went into the water. We just haven't found her yet. But they say, maybe the current took her body out further and she'll likely wash up sometime in the next couple of days.
So that's the next step. What, just wait for a body?
I mean, that's pretty much what they tell the family to do. But the family can't just sit around and do nothing. This makes zero sense to them. Joanne was not suicidal, and if something had snapped in her, in no world did they think that she would take her life in that way.
Yeah, I was actually going to point that out. Like, when you said she's, like a football field into the water even?
2 football fields.
Okay, my point exactly. 2 football fields into, like, this frigid water before she's even able to submerge herself. Like, that's super odd, right?
I mean, I certainly think so. Again, in January, it is freaking freezing. And remember what I had said before, after she dropped her son off that night, she was going to get gas to fill up her car. She didn't need to fill it up to make that trip to the church parking lot. Her plan was just to pray and then get into the water. And actually, the fact that she was even going to church that night was all the more reason for them to think that she didn't do this to herself. Everyone who knew Joanne said she was a devout Catholic, and taking one's own life in that religion is a sin. They said Joanne would never, ever do that. Now, this is all too bizarre already, but what the family also knows, and something that they have stressed to police, is that Joanne was actually afraid for her life in the weeks leading up to her disappearance. She talked about being followed, about her mail being tampered with, and someone potentially listening in on her phone calls. So now that Joanne is actually gone, her family is confident that she wasn't just paranoid. Her fears were founded, and now the family knows something is really not right here. So according to reporting by Scott M. Bernstein that he did for a 3-part series in the Grosse Pointe News, in the very first hours and days after Joanne went missing, the family all got together and they started making their list of suspects. If Joanne didn't kill herself, there is someone involved in her disappearance. So who could that be? And for a suburban mother of 3, that list is longer than you might think. In the research material I have come across, there are 3 main people the family wondered about early on when Joanne first went missing. One was Joanne's husband, who she had been separated from for almost 5 years at this point. This was her kid's father. 2 was her brother, John Matuk, and the people he was connected to. Now, John was actually the one who drove his 2 nieces to the church parking lot that night Joanne went missing. And 3 was a cousin Joanne had a tumultuous relationship with named Tim Matuk. Now, Joanne's ex, David, doesn't have a reputation for being a violent man, but the 3 kids who lived in the Romaine house with David and Joanne when they were together knew that the couple had a reputation for fighting, like a lot. David would travel a lot for work, Joanne suspected infidelity, and so when he was home, it was like bickering nonstop. It was never ending. So the couple ended up separating. And whether it started before or after the separation, I don't exactly know, but at some point, David was rumored to have started up with Joanne's best friend, which is not a great look, and we've seen less complicated love trials end up in tragedy. And there's also the money of it all. A divorce would have been costly to David. And he and Joanne were in the middle of this legal battle. Basically, they were suing some contract workers over black mold that was found on one of their properties. And though they were still ways out from closure on that case, if they won, the damages would be in the ballpark of like $1 million. Now, if Joanne was around, she'd get half. If she wasn't, the whole thing would go to David.
But again, we've seen people kill for less.
Right. But, when they're making this list, that's all they have. A bad relationship, he's better off financially. Does this mean something? Maybe. But they needed police to look into him more. So they write down the next name on their list. John Matuk. Now, it's not so much that they thought John did something directly to Joanne. Of the 5 Matuk siblings, John and Joanne were probably the closest at the time she went missing. But John had fallen on some tough times that could have made him a target for some dangerous people. Like, there was once a time when John was doing ultra well. Like, he was a known businessman in town, made tons of money. He was making those, 40 under 40 lists. But when business went south, John started borrowing money, doing a little gambling, and getting tied up with the wrong people. In that article Scott Bernstein wrote, someone who was with the family in those critical hours when they were brainstorming possibilities said, quote, "They took out a legal pad and literally made a list of all the people who John Matuk owed money to and may have been upset enough to want to do him harm by hurting someone close to him." End quote. One of those people was a man named Anthony Pippia. According to one or more of Bernstein's sources, Anthony was a bookmaker who John owed a decent amount of money to. And Anthony's operation really wrapped my head around this idea that, like, if you're hurting someone's loved one to send a message, like, wouldn't it be important that it's super clear that there was a message and like who it was from? Like, unless John is just playing this ultra coy, he seems to be like, well, it's possible that someone did this, but I don't know who. Either way, again, it is just a name on a list for now. And then there's one more name the family adds. Tim Matouk, Joanne's cousin. Now, this is a name that is specifically sticking out to Michelle as more than just a hunch, because in the weeks leading up to her mom's disappearance, Joanne specifically told her, if something happens to me, look to Tim.
I feel like we should start there. Does she know why her mom said that?
Well, it happened after one particular call Joanne had with Tim leading up to her going missing. But to understand the call, I need to give you a little bit of a backstory. You see, Joanne's parents had been really successful. Like, they had this local wine shop in town that did super well. They were into real estate. So by 1994, when both parents had passed, there was like a $20 million inheritance that was up for grabs. And I say up for grabs, but there was a will and it was supposed to be doled out evenly among the 5 kids. But money, especially inheritance money, I don't know what it does to people, but it makes them lose their GD minds.
Oh my God, you do not need to tell me twice.
Yeah. And the Matouk family was no exception. 2 of the 5 kids, Bill and Rosemary, they were the oldest, were the ones who kept running the wine store. And they were basically accused of taking more money than their fair share. And this got so bad, literally the siblings weren't talking to one another. And in 1998, Joanne and John actually filed suit against the estate. And within a couple of years, they won and were each paid $600,000 in back payments. Of course, it's not like that magically fixed the damage that had occurred over the last 6 years. The family was still very much divided. But this whole time, John and Joanne were kind of on the same team, if you will. Again, they've always been super close. And when he started having business troubles and legal troubles, it wasn't just gambling, he had also gotten busted for a check kiting scheme, it seemed like Joanne blamed her cousin Tim, or maybe Tim and her brother Bill, for John's problems.
Okay, I guess I don't get it.
I don't fully get it either, but it's important to know that at the time, Tim was a police officer. So it's possible that she thought he was maybe feeding information or was the reason he got busted. Again, I don't know the specifics. I just know she had this feeling, and John shared that feeling as well. Now, it's never been proven that Tim was connected or Bill was connected to anything John did or got in trouble for, and Tim wholly denies it, as well as Bill. Denies it now, denied it then, which was actually the reason Tim called Joanne before she went missing. So apparently for a while, the year before she even went missing, she was telling people she was scared of Tim. Scott Bernstein reported, quote, Matouk Romaine's children say that when they were growing up, their mom did her best to keep them away from Tim Matouk, calling him sick and depraved. End quote. But no one knows exactly why. It seemed like she was fine telling everyone she was scared or she didn't like him or wasn't comfortable with him, but wouldn't actually give anyone specifics. Her children feel like she did this because she was trying to protect them, but it doesn't seem like anyone else knows either. Or at least if there was a reason that she told people, it's never been officially reported. But things seemed to come to a head in late 2009 and early 2010. That is when Joanne, after years of not speaking to her brother Bill, went down to his wine store, and according to him, she told him to stay away from Tim, that he was causing problems for John, Tim's bad news. And so then that's when Tim calls Joanne, and he's like, hey, stop, I didn't do anything. You're not making sense. Stop spreading rumors about me and saying that I'm the reason John has all these problems. And according to Tim, that was the extent of the call. But Michelle remembers that call differently. She couldn't hear Tim's side of it, but she was there with her mother when she took the call, and she told Unsolved Mysteries that her mom was screaming, telling Tim to leave her and her family alone, and she told Tim to never call her again before hanging up on him. And she said it was in that moment that Joanne turned to her and said, if something happens to me, look to Tim. Now, there was one more incident that came to Michelle's mind right away, something she just couldn't shake. She said that she had drove her mom one other time back to the wine store to see her brother Bill. Now, they were dropping in unannounced, and Joanne went in alone. Michelle says that when she came back out, she was terrified. Michelle told Scott Bernstein, quote, she came out of that store looking like she'd seen a ghost. Whatever she saw, whatever she heard, whatever she was told in there, it spooked her to the core, and in her mind confirmed her belief that she was in danger. When she got back to the car, she wanted me to take her immediately to church. She thought she could pray it away, end quote. So knowing all of this, Tim makes the family's list. But who that list goes to is a whole nother question. Almost as soon as the search was done, Grosse Pointe Farms Police, which was the responding agency based on where Joanne's car was found, wanted to transfer her case to the Grosse Pointe Woods Police because they said, well, we're saying it's suicide and she lived in woods territory, so your problem now.
Wait, are they really not exploring any other options besides suicide? Like, I get that's the main theory or whatever, but you said they took her car for processing, so I assumed they were gonna, I don't know, process it for evidence or something and see what that tells them?
Well, I don't know if they're looking into any other theories. Honestly, it seems like no. But one of the departments is at least processing the evidence-ish. They dusted the car for prints and didn't find any usable ones that didn't belong to Joanne or her family. But this is another thing that gives the family like giant WTF moments because they're like, okay, you didn't actually take any prints from us to compare. My mom's not here, so I know you don't have her prints. None of us have government jobs. So what are you comparing these prints to? Like, how are you coming to this conclusion?
Seriously?
And also, there was an investigative reporter turned PI who was interviewed by reporter Karen Drew for Click on Detroit. And he says that the type of material inside the car isn't even conducive to getting fingerprints lifted using like the normal method with like dust and stuff like that. He said you'd have to fume inside with super glue and take photographs, which was never done.
I mean, maybe they were preserving it for DNA instead? Like, I know it can be the trade-off sometimes. You get prints or DNA because testing for one ruins your chances of getting the results on the other. Like, swabbing for DNA would smudge the prints, but using glue or even fingerprint dust would disrupt the DNA.
Right, but they didn't do DNA. Specifically because they kept telling the family that there was nothing to point to signs of foul play, so nothing to warrant any criminal investigation like that.
Okay, what about her purse? I mean, you said the first officer on the scene saw her purse in the car. Was there anything missing out of it? Did they, I don't know, process the purse at all?
So they did at least look at it to try and see if anything was missing. I would be looking at it to see if it was like a robbery or something. And they said that everything normal was in there except for her keys and her cell phone. But again, other stuff was in there. Her wallet was in there and $1,500 according to a Marie Claire article by Kristen Igo. And police said that all the straps on her purse were intact, so they didn't consider a robbery to be any kind of motive. But when her family saw the purse, they disagreed. Apparently, it was like almost brand new and had these kind of like ruffles all over the front, and one of them was torn. Now, Michelle swears it wasn't like that before, so to her, it shows her signs of some kind of struggle. But to police, they're like, struggle over what? Again, the money is there. Your mom could have ripped her purse and you didn't know. If anything, her purse was even more of a reason for the police to stick to their guns. They kept insisting. Joanne took her own life. She is going to show up in the water. And 70 days after she first went missing, they were right. But finally finding Joanne didn't bring closure. It only opened a can of worms and deepened the mystery as to what happened that cold January night. On March 20th, 2010, fishermen up in Amherstburg, Ontario, found a body floating in the Detroit River.
Is that connected to Lake St. Clair, where police say Joanne went into the water?
Yeah, it is.
So it makes sense that her body could have ended up there.
Well, hold your horses. I told you nothing about this case makes sense. So Canadian authorities pull the body out of the water. She is fully clothed in all black, just like Joanne was. Same height and build, so it's pretty easy to figure out what department they need to call. Now, despite the fact that Grosse Pointe Woods has taken over the case by this point, Grosse Pointe Farms detectives are the ones that are sent up there. According to more of Scott Bernstein's reporting for Grosse Pointe News, the Canadian authorities said that the detectives were quick to tell them Joanne suffered from mental health issues and no foul play was suspected.
But you already said that she had no history. Like, where are they getting this from?
Well, later they would deny saying that at all, and basically they were just like, oh, well, everyone was saying she was so paranoid before she died, so that's probably what we relayed, like she was under duress. Either way, the Canadian authorities do an autopsy, and they rule Joanne's death a drowning. Her body is then transported back to Michigan, where another autopsy is done. This autopsy concludes the same findings, but makes an additional note that the death is more than likely a suicide because there was no other trauma to her body that would suggest foul play. So police feel like they finally have the missing piece to their puzzle. They can inform the family that Joanne has been found. All of their suspicions have been confirmed, and that's that. A tragic case, yes, but really nothing more. But Joanne's family absolutely does not buy it. First of all, like you had pointed out earlier, yes, the waterways were connected, so technically it made sense that Joanne could end up where she was found, which was like 35 miles away from where they said she went into the water. But remember what I said about the search that night that she went missing? There was no current. No one can explain how her body would have moved there. If it didn't move that night, they should have found her. But they didn't find her, which seems to suggest that the body had moved that night, but it couldn't move that night because the water wasn't moving. So like, how does that work?
And there is your high-pitched, I am in a circle of what is going on.
Brett, this is just the beginning. But like, that doesn't make sense, right?
No, it doesn't. It doesn't make any sense. And I was also thinking about how much ice would have been on the lake. Like, that could have slowed a current. Like,
yeah.
Like, a body couldn't, this is like a crass visual, but just bump up against the ice and not move. It would just kind of get stuck there, right?
Yeah, and okay, so even more than all of that, like if you want to say, okay, she didn't move, to your point, like she got caught in the ice, whatever, if you want to say that this massive search effort missed her somehow, again, one that the search team calls like their most extensive search ever, then you can say, okay, maybe she went to the bottom of the lake, maybe she wasn't floating. Okay, fine. Then at the bottom, she eventually would have had to move 35 miles by water currents being like drug across the bottom of this lake. But when she's found, her clothes and her shoes were in pretty much perfect condition. Like no scuff marks, no drag marks.
No tears, no rips, nothing.
Which everyone says would be almost impossible. And again, if you want to say, well, weird stuff happens, maybe her feet were floating or whatever, okay, then riddle me this. She was in these like 4-inch heels. And remember, the way they're saying she got into the water, she like scoots down these 2 concrete embankments to get in there. She has to basically walk 2 football fields out into the water, and it's like a gravelly bottom.
I would say, you and I grew up like swimming in lakes and ponds and rivers. Like, this is not a concrete pool bottom. Like, it's murky and difficult in bare feet in the summer. We're talking like sub-zero water in 4-inch heels.
Well, yeah. I mean, not only do I think she'd be falling all over the place, but like there's rocks and stuff at the bottom. So again, even if you're going to say she floated 35 miles and her feet didn't touch anything, that's why there's no scuff marks. Surely there's
just getting out there.
Yes.
Would have scuffed her shoes.
Yeah, you gotta be kidding me. There's like no world in which I can make this make sense. And while we're at it, let me tell you something else they find on Joanne that doesn't make any sense. They find her keys. Now remember, those keys were missing from her purse, so at first glance, maybe this is not super weird.
Right.
Except Joanne's keys had already been returned to the family before her body was found.
Wait, I'm confused.
As you should be. And honestly, it was confusing for Michelle when the keys showed up in the first place. Karen Drew reported that the day after Joanne went missing, her keys showed up at the police station, which was awfully convenient. And more convenient is that no one knows how they got to the station, who had possession of them, who brought them by, nothing.
I mean, did one of the family members bring like the spare set so police could move the car and stuff?
No, and here's how they know this. I'm telling you, this case is a total mindfuck, and I am just getting started, so stay with me. So police say that the keys magically showed up the day after Joanne goes missing. Fine. Well, according to more reporting done by Scott Bernstein, when they're returned to the family in early February, so like a week or 2 after Joanne goes missing, again, before her body is found, like immediate red flags go up because her daughter Michelle knows that these weren't the keys her mom had with her the night she went missing. You see, they had 2 sets, a normal set and a spare set. 6 weeks before Joanne went missing, she was showing her house, like an open house kind of thing. And during that, her car keys went missing. So she had been using the spare set. Everyone had been using the spare set. They never found the originals. Well, when the keys get returned to her, again, early February before the body is found, it's the set that went missing 6 weeks before.
Oh my God, I have literal chills. What?
Britt, it makes no sense. Again, between the cops showing up looking for Joanne when Michelle says they should have been looking for her, and then these missing keys showing up, the Romaine family have basically been over the local PD since long before their mom's body was found. And they've already hired their own investigators. But now that Joanne's been found and Grosse Pointe departments just want to call this a suicide and close the case, that's when things really start moving for the family. Because her family's like, fine, close it. We're going to file a Freedom of Information Act request to get the records, and they start pulling records of their own related to Joanne's activity before her death. Now, while they're getting these records, they also hire someone to do an independent autopsy at the University of Michigan. Now, we know 2 autopsies have been done already. It'd be kind of weird to find something different now, but weird is synonymous with this case because this autopsy notes 2 really critical things. One, there were some contusions on her left arm that hadn't been noted before. Now, remember how I said Michelle thought that her mom's purse had been ripped? She says that she always wore it on her left shoulder. So this kind of reinforced for her the idea that someone had potentially grabbed her mom. Now, the second thing found in the autopsy, and this is even more concerning, was that it was found that Joanne died of a dry drowning.
Okay, care to explain that?
It means there was no water in her lungs. Apparently, this is like super rare. It only happens in like 1 to 2% of cases.
Yeah, I mean, I've heard the term because it's something that happens to little kids in pools sometimes. Like, it's kind of like a... and there's water and their body freaks out, but you don't necessarily see it right away or know it right away. It's not like a traditional drowning, but...
No water, Brett.
Like, I mean...
How did she die?
Not only no water, Ashley, that means there's air in her lungs, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I, at least, am under the impression that air rises to the top of water, so she would be floating, right?
She should have been floating that night. Again, this, like we said before, the only way it makes sense for her to end up where she did was to be at the bottom of the lake and then move that way because they didn't find her on the top.
But if there's no water in her lungs, there's nothing keeping her underwater, she's full of air.
She should have been floating on top.
Okay.
Now, Brett. Okay, so that's already weird. They get this autopsy, which again is just like reconfirming every fear, every suspicion, every worry that they've had. And when they start getting the reports in, what was a confusing case turned into total mind fuckery. And I can't even just like throw in bits and pieces that seem odd to like piece this together for you. I almost need to re-walk you through that night according to what the official records say. So let's rewind to January 20th, the night Joanne goes missing. Just like the original story started, Joanne drops her son off at their house around 6 and says she's going to go get gas. By 6:25, she was at the gas station, and the attendant there said she was totally normal, like friendly, whatever, nothing out of the ordinary. Then they know Joanne went to her normal church for a 7 o'clock prayer service. According to the Lady in the Lake episode, reports show that there were 10 to 15 other people there, and witnesses saw Joanne. Now, this is like not a whole church service, it's like a quick prayer thing, and everyone's out the door again by like 7:15. At 7:20, one witness hears a car alarm go off and sees lights flashing. But this only lasts for like 10 to 15 seconds tops, so they think it was just a fluke. Maybe someone hit the alarm button instead of the unlock, so they didn't pay much attention to it. Between 7:25 and 7:35, the last patron at the church leaves. She was a little nervous because, again, she's the last one walking out alone in the dark parking lot. So as she's making her way to her car, she has her eyes darting, like left to right, looking all over the parking lot, being vigilant, but she doesn't see any other cars.
Except for Joanne's Lexus, right?
No, not even Joanne's Lexus.
Wait, but hold up.
Yeah, no, listen. You're trying to process what everyone was at the time. According to witness statements, it seems like her car left and then at some point came back to the parking lot, which doesn't quite fit, right?
Right.
But let me just keep going. Because, maybe the witness was wrong. Either way, the car is for sure back in the parking lot by 8:58, because that is when an officer sees Joanne's car all alone in the parking lot and runs the plates. There's nothing sus about what comes up, so he marks no action on this report. Now, this officer makes no notes of any footprints or anything weird that's standing out to him. He just runs the plates, looks good, on his way.
So he writes no action, but he goes to Joanne's house at like 9:30 or whatever time that was. He does that anyway?
No, this officer writes no action and then really takes no action. It's just a car in a parking lot and he's on his way. But someone shows up at the Romaines' house at 9:24 asking about missing Joanne. Again, from the registration that is tied to Michelle. At 9:30, the U.S. Coast Guard's digital records show that Grosse Pointe Farms contacted them to help with a search. There's also a report listing the official start time of the Grosse Pointe Farms investigation as 9:30 p.m. And at 9:38, the Coast Guard launches crews, and they're on scene looking for Joanne by 9:51. Then, at 9:58, a different officer comes by the parking lot and runs the Lexus's plates. Not the same guy who did before, totally different officer. And he's the one who says he sees those concerning things, the footprints leading away from the car towards the lake, and so he calls it in.
What do you mean he calls it in? Like, the Coast Guard is already on the scene.
Doesn't make much sense, does it?
I don't even think I understand. Like, they're saying something else initially kicked off the investigation. I'm so confused.
No. They're saying it was a concerned officer who saw the footprints that kicked off their investigation.
At 9:58.
At 9:58.
But they're already searching for her at 9:38.
You got it.
No, I do not. How is any of this explained?
Honestly, very poorly. According to Karen Drew, who did amazing reporting on this case, literally like won an Emmy for it, there is one handwritten report from the Coast Guard that states that they were actually called by the Grosse Pointe Farms police at 10:35. So Grosse Pointe Farms stick with that 9:58 time. They're basically saying everything else has to be a mistake. All the digital records are wrong.
Okay.
And they're saying that one handwritten report got it correct. And they're saying all the family has it wrong too. They never showed up at 9:24 because according to them, they didn't know anything was wrong then. They say that they showed up much later and Michelle and her sister must have just gotten it all mixed up. Which they say, is to be expected when you're getting this like traumatizing news that your mom's missing. Except Joanne's family have some digital records of their own that back up their version of events. Between 9:29 and 10:32, they call their mom's cell phone 13 times. In the Grosse Pointe News, it said 8 of those 13 calls were before 10 p.m., before the plate was even supposedly run. So why on earth are these grown adults blowing up their mom's phone if they don't know she's missing? I mean, it matches their story perfectly. Cops show up at 9:24, you talk to them, you find out what's going on, and within 5 minutes, you're calling your mom over and over again, hoping that this is some kind of horrible mistake. It doesn't work the other way.
Right.
Because in that scenario, it shows that you're blowing up your mom just because it's 9:30 and she wasn't home. You call her a bunch of times, and then after police show up at your house, at what they say is 10:24, you only make like 1 or 2 more calls. Like, how does that make sense?
I mean, it doesn't.
Yet this is the story everyone's sticking with.
I mean, I don't like any of this, but just for the sake of argument, what if you said this is all some terrible clerical error, digital error, human error across the board, whatever? The times are wrong. What's important is that they got the search crews out there as soon as they knew a woman was missing. Do the times really even matter that much?
Well, I think they do, combined with everything else we know. Police looking for Joanne and not Michelle, who again the car was really registered to. The missing keys turning up that no one can explain. And what if I told you that there was another missing persons report from that same day, same church parking lot, same lake that got 0 attention? That report will change everything you know about this case. And I'm going to have to tell you about that next week, or you can listen right now if you're in the fan club. Don't forget to come back next week for part 2, or you can join our fan club on our website, crimejunkiepodcast.com, to listen right now. You can also find all of the source material for this episode on the website as well.
And be sure to follow us on Instagram at Crime Junkie Podcast.
We'll be back next week with part 2. Crime Junkie is an Audio Chuck production. So, what do you think, Chuck? Do you approve? Hi, Crime Junkies. I'm your host, Ashley Flowers.
And I'm Britt.
And we are back with part 2 of our episode on the mysterious death of Joanne Matouk Romaine. This is possibly one of the most twisty stories I've ever come across in our 4 years of doing this show. So I'm telling you, you cannot just jump in here. Go back and listen to episode 1. But here is a quick recap, because I know there's a lot to process. In January 2010, police say Joanne Matouk Romaine went to a prayer service, then walked across the street down this snow-covered cement embankment into the freezing lake to take her own life. Mind you, she would have had to walk 2 football fields out into the water in those heels of hers to get deep enough to drown, but that doesn't seem to bother any of the officials. It also doesn't seem to bother them that despite their extensive search the very night she went missing, Joanne's body was discovered 70 days later, 35 miles away, even though there was no current that could have taken her that far. And there wasn't a single disturbance or scuff mark on her shoes. Finding her body just confirmed police's theory of a suicide. But the family was resistant and hired their own PIs and did their own autopsy and got all the records, which just opened up a floodgate that raised a zillion questions. The private autopsy, which by that time was the 3rd autopsy, showed Joanne had died of a dry drowning, meaning there was no water in her lungs. She had contusions on her left arm, the same arm she usually carried her purse on, which was found torn. And then there's the timeline. All of the digital records show that police learned about Joanne's abandoned car half an hour after a full-on search was started. It all feels staged. And Britt, you ended the last episode with a great question. And here I'm actually going to play the end of the last episode so everyone gets it exactly.
I don't like any of this, but just for the sake of argument, what if we said this was all some terrible clerical error, digital error, human error across the board, whatever? The times are wrong. What's important is that they got the search crews out there as soon as they knew a woman was missing. Do the times really even matter that much?
Well, I think they do, combined with everything else we know. Police looking for Joanne and not Michelle, who again the car was really registered to. The missing keys turning up that no one can explain. And what if I told you that there was another missing persons report from that same day, same church parking lot, same lake that got 0 attention? You can still support our work and listen ad-free by joining the fan club. You get every episode ad-free that we've ever done, and you get up to 3 extra episodes a month depending on which level you sign up for. So, the very first case our reporter Nina dug into is from right here in Indianapolis. It's a case of a woman who died nearly a decade ago while out on a walk with her dogs, but there still hasn't been justice. Our team spent months tracking down public records, researching and interviewing people so we could bring you this story in a whole new, meaningful way. This is the story of the mysterious death of Charisse Walker Bingham. In the early evening of Wednesday, December 12, 2012, a bicyclist is out on White River Trail here in Indianapolis. And it's in the heart of downtown and is usually a popular spot to walk or jog or ride bikes, but the trail is pretty quiet on this particular evening. At around 6:40 p.m., the bicyclist sees something so out of place that they think their mind must be playing tricks on them. Except it's not. They see the body of a woman lying on the asphalt trail, and she's not moving. The cyclist calls 911 right away, and EMS and Indiana State Police respond. They see the woman just as the 911 caller had described. She's on the ground, face down in a pool of blood. And around her body, standing guard, are 2 big German shepherds. They're not wearing leashes, and they won't let anyone near the victim, including first responders. But if they're being aggressive, it's because all they want to do is protect this woman on the ground.
Oh my God, that is so sad.
Indianapolis Animal Care is called to the scene to help get the shepherds out of the first responders' way. And in order to do that, they have to sedate both of them with tranquilizer darts and then take them away from the trail. That's like, again, how fiercely they are guarding this woman. Only then is it safe for medics to check the unresponsive woman for signs of life, which they quickly determine aren't there. She's fully clothed and wearing sneakers, so medics roll her onto her back, and they see blood on her face. But according to court records, they can't figure out what's causing the bleeding because they can't even tell what her injuries are.
Why not? Because all of the blood?
I'm not sure. There aren't many details about that in the record I just mentioned, which is an affidavit for probable cause. It might be because the woman is wearing several layers of clothing, including a pair of coveralls. I mean, again, this is like Indiana in the winter. She's out for a walk, so maybe they can't determine where the bleeding is coming from because of that.
Right.
But there is a big clue on the ground right near her body, a .25 caliber handgun. And that's not all. There's also a driver's license, an Indiana firearm open carry permit, a pair of black winter gloves, and an open flip-style cell phone, which has a low battery alert going on. So thankfully, at least one task is really easy: identifying the victim. The driver's license belongs to 51-year-old Indianapolis resident Sharice Walker Bingham. According to the coroner's report, Sharice is officially declared dead at 7:15 p.m. Emergency medics now have a potential crime scene to secure, and they don't want to disturb it any more than they already have. They also don't want to move Sharice again, so they leave her laying on her back. So that's how Indiana State Police Detective Lester Norvell finds her when he gets to the trail at around 8:30 p.m. He sees the blood and a white foamy substance around Sharice's face and mouth, and he can't help but feel somewhat overwhelmed as he takes in the scene. Normally, the Indianapolis Metropolitan Police Department would handle a death investigation like this in the city, but the trail is actually part of the White River State Park, which means that the investigation falls onto the Indiana State Police's jurisdiction. And as Detective Norvell told Nina, this sort of thing happening on state property is not like an everyday thing. So he tries to take everything in as he's brought up to speed by other law enforcement. Police process the area around Sharice's body and canvass for witnesses. But unfortunately, they don't find any eyewitnesses to interview. Even the cyclist who found Sharice didn't actually see anything happen. They just rode up and found her like that. And despite there being lights in different spots along the trail, it was still fairly dark in the area where Sharice had been walking. And Sharice's body was found far enough down the path that anyone driving on nearby New York Street probably wouldn't have been able to see her.
So does Sharice live downtown, or did you just like going there just for walks or what?
Well, so she didn't live downtown, but her house, which was on Kessler Boulevard North Drive, is really close to downtown. It's about maybe an 8-minute drive from her home to the part of the trail that she was on, which is like right next to IUPUI, which is like a university campus. And in fact, police actually found her Ford Explorer parked nearby alongside North White River Parkway West Drive. Now, the parkway and the trail are parallel to each other, separated by the river that runs through downtown Indy. So to get from her parking spot to the trail, Sharice would have walked across the New York Street Bridge. And that takes 5 or 6 minutes, depending on how fast you're going. And listen, it's kind of hard to understand the layout without seeing it, so we actually have some photos and maps on our blog post for this website or in the app if you're listening there to help you kind of get a better sense of it. Now, obviously, police have an address for Sharice, and they know that they're going to have to go to her house and notify her next of kin. But, as it turns out, they don't need to make the trip. Just before 11:30 p.m., another ISP detective named Wayne Billings is securing the area around Sharice's car when a man in a pickup truck pulls up near the spot and announces that he's looking for his wife. He says that his name is Eugene Bingham Jr., and he's worried because his wife, Sharice, never came home from walking their dogs. Right then and there, police break the news to Eugene that Sharice is gone, and they immediately ask if he can help them retrace Sharice's last movements. So Eugene tells detectives that he last saw Sharice when she left the house with their German shepherds, Mayday and Tsunami, at 7:30 p.m. He says he stayed home and dozed off while watching a basketball game on TV, and then when he woke up around 9 usual, because she should have been home by then, getting ready for work, because Sharice actually worked an overnight shift at the PepsiCo Gatorade plant, and she had to clock in by 10:30 p.m. So Eugene says that he tried to call her cell phone right away, and when she didn't answer, he left the house to go look for her. He goes on to tell detectives that there are really only 3 places that they ever walked the dog, and all of them are close by, so he checked all 3, and White River State Park was his last stop. Now, right away, Eugene's story seems off to investigators. Not so much because of what he said, but when he said things happened.
Right, I mean, I was just thinking, didn't you say that her body was found by the cyclist at like 6:40 p.m.? So
yeah, no.
How could she
Exactly.
Okay.
Eugene is saying that she left the house almost a full hour after we know her body was found, and 15 minutes after she was officially declared dead.
Right, which is a little bit bizarre, but to be fair, he had just gotten some really traumatic news about his wife, and maybe it was shock, or the details of the night were kind of all mixed up to correct his story. I guess what I'm asking is, does he have an alibi?
No, so he and Charisse didn't have any kids, and Eugene says that he was home alone, and no friends came over or anything like that. But really, police aren't looking for an alibi just yet. According to the affidavit, which was written by Detective Norvell, in the early stages of this investigation, based on everything found at the scene, especially the gun right near Charisse, police were actually under the impression that she might have intentionally shot herself.
I mean, a killer could have just dropped the gun, which I realize is not super likely, but...
Well, that's not the only thing, though. Detective Norvell told Nina that another huge reason that they thought it might be self-inflicted was because Charisse was with her dogs. Police thought that made a random stranger attack or mugging very unlikely. I mean, if you're picking out someone to rob or assault, are you really going to go for the person who's got 2 big, protective German Shepherds by her side? Literally so protective they won't leave her side after something happened to her?
Yeah, that's a really good point.
And remember, along with the gun was her pistol permit. And kind of to what you just said, the detective said it's not common for shooters to just leave the murder weapon right there at the scene of a crime if they're trying to hide what they've done. But never judge a book by its cover, because despite these 2 pretty convincing pieces of evidence that seem to point towards suicide, it doesn't take long for police to start leaning away from that theory. One of the very first things that detectives learn about Charisse is that she loved her dogs. Literally everyone who knew Charisse knew how much she loved her dogs. So, if she wanted to kill herself, why would she do it while she was walking them in a public park, knowing that they would be left out there with no one to watch them?
Yeah, those are her babies. I would imagine it'd be incredibly difficult for someone who, adored their dogs the way, everyone's saying she did, to do something like that in front of them.
Right, in my mind, even if the walk was some kind of ruse and you didn't want to be at home with your husband and you use the dogs as an excuse to get out, you leave the dogs in the car so they're safe and they don't freeze. Again, dead of winter in Indianapolis. Oh, and that's the other thing. Charisse had put on layers of clothes to keep warm. She had brought snacks. She locked her car and even took the time to put on one of those anti-theft devices on the steering wheel.
So a lot of things that was saying she was coming back and wanted to have an enjoyable walk with her dogs.
Yeah, police are looking at all of this and thinking that her actions just aren't lining up with someone planning to take their own life. And Eugene, by the way, is adamant that Charisse would never intentionally shoot herself. At least, that's what he tells detectives when he sits down with them for a formal interview at the station the day after the shooting on December 13th. Eugene says that Charisse was a very routine person. She had her daily schedule, she stuck to it like clockwork, and she had been working overnight as a machine operator at the Gatorade plant since June of that year, so just a little over 6 months. On work days, she would do some stuff around the house, she would exercise, walk the dogs, and then go to her job. And even on her days off, her habits didn't change much in terms of what she liked to do. And he tells detectives that up until the point when Charisse didn't come home, Wednesday night was like any other night. He says sometimes he would join Charisse when she walked the dogs, but that night he wanted to stay home and watch the NBA game. It was the Miami Heat versus the Golden State Warriors.
And is he still saying that Charisse left her house at 7:30 that night?
Actually, and this is strange, according to Detective Norvell's affidavit, Eugene now says that she left even later, at 7:45. He says that Charisse was getting ready to leave the house at 7:30, and he's not just guessing. He tells detectives that he's sure of the timing because he was watching pregame coverage while she got the dogs ready, and she left with them around tip-off, he says. Now, he didn't know which of her 3 usual walking spots she was planning to go to, because he says that when he asked, she told him she's going, quote, wherever my heart takes me. So Eugene says that he was down in the basement of their house where he watched the basketball game and dozed off. And as soon as he woke up from his nap, around 9:15, 9:30, he knew something wasn't right because the landing of the basement stairs was empty. If Charisse was back, which she should have been, Mayday or Tsunami would have been laying on the landing. This is like what they do. So a little concerned, he called Charisse's cell phone from their landline. She didn't pick up, which wasn't a huge surprise to him because he said that she almost never had her cell powered on. But he's still concerned enough about the whole situation that he got dressed and went out looking for her. He said that at that point, he left the house, he tried to call her again, this time from his own cell phone, and again got no answer.
Wait, why is he trying to call her a second time if she never had her cell phone on?
He doesn't address that specifically, as far as I can tell from the affidavit, but if it were me, if I thought something was wrong with Eric, even if, I know he doesn't pick up often, I still think I would keep calling anyways, just, in a panic, kind of.
Right.
Now, Eugene also tells detectives that it's his and Charisse's 28th wedding anniversary. It's actually coming up the next day on December 14th. And he says that the two of them were kind of joking around about it the night before. He told her that, after this many years together, anniversaries were just another day to him. But he'd make a reservation if she wanted to go somewhere special. And she said something like, okay, I'm going to make you pay a whole lot of money for that or whatever. But Eugene describes their conversation as somewhat playful, not an argument or anything. Now, obviously, police have a lot of questions about this period of time leading up to Charisse's death. But that's not the only thing they want to speak with Eugene about. Because earlier that day, an anonymous caller had contacted state police with a bombshell of a tip. The anonymous caller told detectives that Eugene had been having an affair. And not just a one-night stand. No, the caller told police that Eugene had been carrying on this affair for 14 years.
Oh my God, that's half of his marriage.
Right? Detective Norvell told Nina that it's incredibly unusual to get a tip like that so early on in an investigation. But obviously they jump on it right away. So literally, while the police still have Eugene at the station for his interview on December 13th, they start asking him about this affair. And at first, he plays it down oh, that's just a fling. It ended 4 years ago because Charisse found out. And he says that their marriage went through a rough patch after the affair came to light, but that they'd worked through it. And he decided that he was going to be committed to Charisse. According to the affidavit, Eugene describes Charisse as his, quote, buddy. And he said that they had a good relationship. But police push him on his infidelity. And eventually, he admits that the affair, it was more than just a fling. And, like the caller implied, it was still going on.
Ooh, that is not a good look.
Yeah, you think? Eugene reluctantly tells investigators about his longtime girlfriend, who we are going to call Jane. He says that they hooked up as recently as Jane's birthday in late September. And of course, police ask him for her info. They're definitely going to want to talk to her too. But Eugene's actually, I don't want to give you her info until I have a chance to speak with her and kind of give her a heads up that you'll be reaching out.
Okay, I reiterate, definitely not a good look.
Yeah, and obviously that's not gonna fly. So eventually Eugene gives investigators Jane's phone number. And before they wrap up the interview, he also agrees to let them take a quick look at his cell phone so they can basically screenshot his recent texts and call history, stuff like that. And they specifically asked him if he had deleted anything from his phone activity, and he says no. Meanwhile, the Marion County Coroner's Office has performed Charisse's autopsy, and the preliminary results are in. The cause of death is a gunshot wound to the right side of her chest. And what police learned from Eugene is that Charisse actually did own a gun, specifically a .25 caliber Sterling semi-automatic handgun, which is the firearm that was found at the scene. In fact, according to Detective Norvell, Charisse's gun used to belong to Eugene. He told police that he gave it to her after he went out and bought a new gun just like it for himself. So, just to clarify there, Charisse and Eugene had identical guns. And not only that, he makes it known to police that it was his job to clean both of them.
So basically he's saying that he handled it on a regular basis.
Exactly, just making sure that they know that. Now, of course, Eugene isn't the only person police interview in the days following Cherise's death. They need to get a full picture of who she was outside of her husband's perspective. So they talk to her family members, her friends, her pastor, anyone who can give them some insight. Everyone describes Cherise, whose nickname is Reese, as a generous, hard-working woman who had a great sense of style and a way of carrying herself. She was the furthest thing from haughty or self-obsessed, though. Loved ones say that she was actually kind of shy and kept to herself most of the time, which meant she didn't really have many close friends. But she also wasn't the type to make enemies. And everyone that police interviewed is shocked, not just by the fact that she died, but by the way she died. No one understands how this could have happened. And they all insist Cherise never would have killed herself. And listen, I know we've talked about a lot of potential suicide deaths on this show, and we know how quickly that decision can be made.
Yeah, I think I remember from a past episode, it's something like within 5 minutes or something.
Right, so, planning events or being happy the day before, that doesn't rule out suicide. But remember, one of the main reasons that it was so unlikely in this case is that her dogs would have been left unattended.
Right.
So we actually sent Nina to speak with some of the people that investigators interviewed, and here's Cherise's older brother, Keith Walker.
She was tall and beautiful. She was a loving parent too.
She helped people without them even asking.
Keith and Cherise were pretty tight while growing up. They didn't come from a huge family, and in total there were only 3 siblings. Keith, another brother named Malcolm, and Cherise was the youngest. Their mother, Carol, died in 1988 when Cherise was 27, and Keith says that they weren't really close with their father, Leon. In high school, Cherise's skills on the basketball court got her mentioned in a local paper, the Indianapolis News, but it doesn't look like she pursued it in terms of like a college career. And she later earned a bachelor's degree in telecommunications. Over the years, there were periods of time when she and her family didn't speak much. They all had kind of gone their separate ways, like a lot of siblings do. But in the time leading up to her death, she'd reconnected with Keith and his wife Linda, along with her aunt, a woman named Deborah McMurray. According to Keith, Cherise had always wanted to have children with Eugene, and they'd actually tried in vitro fertilization, but it didn't work. So she put all of her care and energy into spoiling her nieces and nephews, and of course, Mayday and Tsunami. Deborah says that Cherise had a gift for training and understanding dogs, especially German Shepherds.
She loved her dogs, honey. Everybody knew that about Reese. We've been knowing that ever since she was a little girl. They loved her. She loved them. Every day they walked.
Wait, speaking of the dogs, whatever happened to Mayday and Tsunami after Animal Control took them away?
Of course, you and I think the exact same way.
Yeah, that's wait, we got off track. Where are the dogs?
Yeah. This question actually comes up about the dogs in every internet forum on the case, and there really wasn't much concrete information available. So, but again, Nina, got to the bottom of it. She actually got a hold of some public records from Animal Control, and she spoke with Cherise's former vet. Basically, to sum it up, again, once they were, tranquilized and taken away from the scene, one of the dogs was taken to an emergency vet hospital. It doesn't say why. But Detective Norville said that the dogs were regurgitating blood, which police assumed they had gotten into at the scene. So that might have had something to do with it. Whatever.
Wait, do police know for sure, though, whose blood the dogs had gotten into at the scene? How do we know the blood was Cherise's and didn't come from, say, someone that attacked them?
We don't know for sure, but police are pretty confident that the blood Tsunami and Mayday got into belonged to Cherise. And the detective says that there's no indication the dogs did get into a fight with a killer or anyone else. And this is actually important too. Actually, investigators checked local hospitals. There were no reports of any kind of dog bite type injuries at the time of the shooting. Mm-hmm. So basically, long story short, both dogs spent the night of the 12th at Animal Control, recovering and sleeping off the tranquilizers. And then the next day, around 11 o'clock in the morning, Eugene came to claim them. But he didn't take them home right then and there. You see, police had actually put a hold on the dogs because they were considered evidence in Sharice's death investigation.
This might be the first time I've ever heard of a puppet becoming a part of probable cause.
Yeah. Now, the kennel staff told Eugene that they couldn't release Mayday and Tsunami until police gave the okay. That afternoon, investigators went to the kennel, took the dogs' collars for evidence, and then the dogs were free to go. What's super interesting is that according to animal care records, a woman called the kennel on December 14th to ask about the dogs. She told staff there that she wanted to see if she could adopt them because she was a friend of Sharice's and they'd grown up together. She also told them that she, quote, just found out as of today that Sharice was killed by her husband, end quote.
Wait, what? Did I miss something? Had police named Eugene as a suspect?
Police have not made any announcements about Eugene being a suspect. But I think she said it because by this point, some people, including some of Sharice's own family members, are thinking that Eugene could have been involved.
Well, I mean, he is the husband, so...
Right, but that's not the only reason. Sharice had been spending more time with her family in the weeks leading up to her death. And according to her aunt Deborah, Sharice had recently opened up about her issues she had with Eugene, whose nickname was Bo Peep. So Sharice started calling Deborah pretty much every day, and they talked for hours. And during their marathon phone session, Sharice said Eugene had been keeping secrets from her. Now, the details are a little hazy on this because obviously we can't talk to Sharice. But Deborah says the first major thing to come to light was that Sharice found out that Eugene had lost his job. He'd been employed at the Indianapolis Water Company for years while also working part-time at UPS.
Wait, so 2 jobs, a wife, and a girlfriend on the side? Like, when did this guy even sleep?
Right? Now, what's important is actually Sharice's family says Eugene and Jane, remember his girlfriend, that's what we're calling her, worked together at UPS, and that's how they met. So he actually probably managed to see her while working there. Anyway, the water company that he worked at was sold to a new company in 2011. And when the ownership changed, Eugene was required to take a drug test to keep his job. He couldn't pass the drug test, and it's not clear if he got fired or quit, but either way, he was no longer working there by the winter of 2012. But according to Deborah, Eugene never informed Sharice about that whole situation. But at some point, Sharice had found a letter or a document about him losing his job, and that was the catalyst for her to really start digging around and learning more about what he'd been up to. Because again, if you think someone's going to work, like, what are you doing all day?
Right.
And moreover, it's like, okay, if you're lying about this, what else are you hiding?
Yeah, is this some sort of domino effect?
Right. Deborah says Sharice also found out about some property that Eugene and Jane owned together. Plus, Eugene had retired from UPS by then, but apparently, again, he's still leaving the house every day, acting like he was going to work. So, from there...
You said that in the days leading up to her death that she absolutely knew that he was having an affair?
Oh, yes. Definitely. She knew. She found out everything.
Deborah even says Sharice was planning to leave Eugene.
She said she was sleeping with him. And she was ready to go. She pawned the ring and everything. It was gone. She didn't want to be with him. Seriously.
Wow, okay, so back up. Had Sharice actually found out about Jane years ago, like Eugene said? Or did she just find out about her, like, right before she died?
So we're not sure about that. It is possible Sharice found out years before and maybe thought the affair was over, only to find out right before she died that it was still going on. But it's also possible that she didn't know anything about it until right before she died.
I mean, with all that tension, Eugene's explanation about how he and Sharice were buddies just doesn't seem to add up to me. Like, this doesn't sound like a couple who would want to be joking around about their anniversary coming up.
Definitely not. Although Deborah isn't sure if Sharice ever got the chance to confront Eugene about everything. So maybe Sharice hadn't said anything yet, or maybe she brought up some issues, but like not other issues. I don't know. Maybe Eugene lied about the whole conversation. We just don't know the exact timing of who found out what, when, and exactly what point it was addressed between Sharice and Eugene, or if it ever was addressed before Sharice died. Here's what's wild, though. The state of her marriage wasn't the only thing bothering Charisse in the time leading up to her death. She was actually telling other people that she felt like her life was in danger. When Charisse and her brother's wife, Linda, went to vote together on Election Day in November 2012, Charisse told Linda that she felt unsafe going out in public.
She felt like somebody was following her at one point. So that's why whenever she went walking, she always had her gun. She always had it in a pouch. She said she never left home without it.
Charisse told Deborah that she thought someone driving a blue Blazer with dark-tinted windows was following her. She said she didn't know if she was being paranoid or not, but she was freaked out.
So did police ever look for the Blazer after Charisse's death?
Detective Norvell said that they did give it some attention, but the vehicle never turned up, and pretty much the lead died there. Now, obviously, Charisse had some pretty heavy stuff on her mind. But there were also really positive things going on in her life. Like, she was very devoted to her faith and had recently become a member of the New Haven Missionary Baptist Church. Bishop Charles McLean Jr. is a pastor of the church, and he remembers when he first met Charisse about a year and a half before her death.
She heard about us by word of mouth and visited a Bible study, and then a Sunday morning she said she just couldn't get enough. She was hooked, so to speak. And she continued to be faithful up until the very end. She carried a light. I haven't seen that in a lot of people, but she stuck out no matter where she was. And I believe that was synonymous to her personality and to the spirit that lived in her.
Charisse even decided to get baptized at the church.
I baptized her. It was her second baptism, but she had stated that she had gone through a few things and had understood that her walk with Christ was a little different than when she was smaller, and she wanted to rededicate her life and be rebaptized, and so we honored that.
Eugene knew how much the church meant to Charisse. So when it's time to plan her homegoing, he decides to have it there. And a homegoing is a traditional African-American Christian funeral service, which gives people a chance to be together and mourn while also celebrating their loved one going home to heaven.
And was Eugene a member at this church too?
Well, I'll let Bishop McLean answer that one.
She came on her own. She would come by herself every Sunday. In fact, I didn't know about a spouse or anything until the very end. We never knew she was even married.
I'm sorry, what?
I know. Honestly, that's a detail that has just stuck with me. I mean, clearly this church and the people there meant a lot to Charisse. And maybe it just goes back to her being a private person. I don't know, but when I heard that, I thought it was wild.
Yeah.
Bishop McLean says that he never even heard Charisse mention Eugene, like not even in passing. So as you can imagine, this now is a lot for the church to take in. I mean, one day Bishop McLean is getting to know Charisse, baptizing her, and the next day he's helping the husband that he didn't even know existed plan a homegoing service for this vibrant woman who had been totally fine the last time he saw her.
Bishop, I've had several tragedies since I was the pastor, but accidents and things of that nature. But this is the first up until this day, and I've been here 13 years, that I've ever experienced that pastorally, someone's life being taken in that manner.
On December 22nd, one day before Charisse's 52nd birthday, the church is packed with people who wanted to say their goodbyes. Plainclothes officers are also there so they can see who shows up, who doesn't show up, and how people act. Eugene really goes all out for this homegoing. Charisse's family says that he bought her new jewelry to wear. A program for the service was filled with photos of them together, of Charisse as a kid, a family, their dogs, and there was even a message printed in it that Eugene wrote to his wife, telling her how much he loved her and missed her. They even had a joint burial plot. All the actions you would expect from a devoted, grieving husband. But here's the thing. Eugene's behavior at the funeral actually raises more suspicion. Now, you guys all know that we always tell you crime junkies, everyone grieves differently, and you can't judge someone else's grief, right or wrong.
Totally.
But I do think it's relevant how people were perceiving it, people close to Charisse. So I want you to hear what Charisse's pastor has to say about Eugene's demeanor during the funeral.
I know everybody does not mourn the same. I've buried hundreds of people. Before I became the pastor, I used to be the chapel minister at a local funeral home. So I've seen just about every level of grieving and the response to it. But in this instance, it seemed I was very unsettled by his response, his body language. He showed no emotion. None.
Like he didn't care?
Like he wasn't even here. And we have people that didn't know her but for a year and a half with tears in their eyes. And he was just kind of, I'm here, but I'm not. And it was that way from the time I met him here to shake his hand until the time we went to the burial site. He didn't say a word. He didn't say amen. He didn't nod. He just sat there very stoic and reserved.
Bishop McLean remembers Eugene sitting apart from Sharice's family at the church. They were all in the front pew, but Eugene sat at one end, apparently by himself, and there was this big gap between him and her close relatives.
He was isolated from the very beginning. And we all was kind of looking like, well, what's his deal? What's going on? Is that the husband? And it wasn't just me. It was even the leaders and the people that were on the platform, choir stand, looking out.
So these aren't just the feelings of one pastor, who, by the way, is also a captain with the Marion County Sheriff's Office.
Oh.
Yeah. Sharice's sister-in-law, Linda, even remembers funeral guests commenting on Eugene's strained, detached attitude to the family.
It was unbelievable. He just sit there like it was no big deal.
By the time of Sharice's homegoing, police are confident she didn't intentionally shoot herself. But that doesn't mean they can call it homicide either. They still have to consider the option that Sharice died as a result of some kind of tragic accident. And Eugene certainly seems to think that that's the case. On Christmas Eve, he calls Detective Norvell with some news. He had found Sharice's gun pouch, which he refers to as a fanny pack, at their home.
And Linda said that Sharice always carried her gun in that pouch, right?
Right, but it wasn't found at the scene. And because Sharice didn't have the pouch, Eugene tells the detectives that she must have been carrying the gun in her coveralls. Now, the coveralls she was wearing were actually an old pair of Eugene's. And he says that the hip pockets had holes in them, so Sharice would have had to carry the gun in the breast pocket. And since she was right-handed, he thinks that she would have kept the gun in the right breast pocket.
So basically, Eugene is saying that Sharice didn't have her gun pouch, she couldn't carry her gun in her hip pockets, so she must have had it in this pocket on the right side of her chest.
Exactly. And he's even more sure this is an accident because of something that had happened before. He tells police that Sharice's gun had jammed during a recent trip they'd taken to the shooting range together. And he wasn't sure if she consistently checked to make sure the safety was on. He also goes on to say that Sharice had mentioned wanting to carry her gun with a round chamber, like locked, loaded, and ready to go. But he warned her not to do that because he thought that it was too dangerous. And then he even implies to the detective that Sharice was kind of accident-prone, saying she was, quote, not clumsy, but she had her moments.
So he's essentially giving them a ton of reasons to say, hey, I think she shot herself accidentally.
Right. Now, all of what he said could make an accident more plausible. But of course, there are still a lot of questions surrounding Eugene. I mean, you can't ignore the fact that his timeline is way off. He has no solid alibi, and he carried an affair on for years behind his wife's back. Still, while police have their suspicions, they want to avoid tunnel vision. So before Detective Norvell hangs up the phone with Eugene on Christmas Eve, he asks him to take a polygraph exam. And Eugene actually agrees. On January 9th, 2013, about a month after Sharice's death, Eugene sits down with a state police polygraph examiner for a pre-test interview, which is the first step in the overall exam process. He gives police the same timeline of Sharice's last night. The details don't change. And he also talks a lot about the two dogs. German Shepherds are considered to be one of the most loyal dog breeds, and clearly Mayday and Tsunami could be really ferocious when it came to protecting Sharice. Eugene says that that's been the case since they've gotten the dogs. They would go bananas even when Sharice wasn't in any danger. Eugene remembers the dogs getting aggressive when someone tried to give her a hug once, so he's sure there's no way a stranger could have approached Charisse on the trail, disarmed her, and shot her without the dogs mauling that person.
Wait, so at the time of this polygraph, does everyone know for a fact that the gun found at the scene was Charisse's, or is there still a question of that?
Well, Eugene thinks it's a proven fact that the gun found at the scene was Charisse's. Again, she owned one that was the exact same kind. And the coroner had already told him that the bullet used in the shooting was recovered during Charisse's autopsy. So, he's under the impression that the police had already matched the bullet to her gun. But actually, at this point, police do not know that for a fact. They're confident the firearm from the scene is Charisse's gun, but they don't actually have any lab reports back yet, so nothing that officially ties that specific gun to the rifling marks on the bullet found in Charisse. So as it stands, Eugene is sure that Charisse didn't intentionally shoot herself. He's sure the dogs would have protected her if a stranger was trying to harm her, and he also can't think of anyone they know who would want to kill her. So the polygraph examiner asks him, okay, what do you think happened? And Eugene says that he's been going over the possible scenarios in his head, and he has a theory which he felt could help explain everything. And brace yourself, Brett, because it's a doozy. So in this interview before his polygraph exam, Eugene tells investigators that he believes it's possible that their dogs, Mayday and Tsunami, accidentally shot Charisse.
Wait, the dogs did it? So we're taking the dogs from evidence to, suspects? Is that really what he said?
Yeah, that was pretty much my reaction too. But in fairness, it's not like he's saying Mayday or Tsunami picked up the gun and aimed at her and fired. His thought is maybe she had the gun in that breast pocket of the coveralls, the safety wasn't on, and it had a round in the chamber, and one of the dogs jumped on her, causing it to fire. And I know it feels like a reach, but believe it or not, dogs have accidentally shot their owners before. It's not like a daily occurrence or anything, but it's not unheard of. Actually, the Washington Post reported that there were at least 10 different cases of dogs shooting their owners from 2004 to 2015. And since then, at least 3 other people have been shot by their dogs. A guy from New Mexico in 2018, a woman from Oklahoma in 2019, and just last year, a man from Texas. But the dogs being the accidental shooters isn't Eugene's only theory. He also says maybe Charisse slipped and fell, and that caused the gun to go off. Basically, every theory he offers revolves around this being an accident. Eugene tells the test examiner that this whole situation has been a nightmare for him, and he just wants it to be over with. He also says that he really misses his wife, which he admits is a surprise, even to him, because he didn't think he would miss her so much.
Is he saying that he thought he wouldn't miss her after she was dead?
Yeah, investigators don't take that as a confession or anything. I guess you had to be there to hear how it sounded, but it did strike some of the detectives as really off. So the polygraph examiner peppers Eugene with a few more questions and asks him hypothetical stuff like, what should happen to a person who kills their wife? Eugene's responses are all, they should go to jail, and if someone's unhappy in their relationship, they should just leave, that kind of thing. But as investigators learn, Eugene had a big incentive to stay in his marriage. Because it turns out Charisse had 2 life insurance policies, which combined were worth nearly $500,000. She had a policy from Allstate for $200,000 and a policy from Protective Life for $250,000.
Whoa.
Yeah, and really, this is a huge surprise to everyone. All in all, Eugene and Charisse didn't seem to be struggling financially, but they weren't out buying super expensive stuff or living extravagantly either. I mean, they had a modest 2-bedroom home and they drove older model cars. Charisse made $41,000 a year at Pepsi. And Eugene, remember, is no longer working at either of his previous jobs by December 2012, although he does say that he gets a pension from UPS. And apparently he'd also invested in a couple of small businesses, but he tells detectives that those haven't really been successful. And again, like I mentioned, they don't have any kids, so this really seems like a lot of life insurance money, of which Eugene is the sole beneficiary. And listen, he's not ignorant to the fact that police see the money as a strong motive. Here, but these are some verbatim quotes from Eugene that Detective Norvell included in his affidavit. Can you read them for us?
Yeah. Eugene said, quote, "If I would have been with her that night, this really would have been even more of a nightmare. I'll probably be in jail. I mean, considering everything that y'all got. I mean, well, I don't know what y'all have. I mean, you know, but it's just wild. Other than the fact that my fingerprints wouldn't have been on the gun. I mean, say, for example, we were walking and she slipped and the gun went off. It's a wild scenario to think about." End quote.
He goes on to say that he wishes he could have been there with Charisse that night, but he doesn't elaborate. So his pre-polygraph interview is definitely enlightening to investigators. But now it's time for the actual polygraph. The examiner asks Eugene 3 relevant questions. 1, did you shoot Charisse? 2, are you the one who shot Charisse? And 3, do you know for sure who shot Charisse? Eugene answers no to all 3. And when the examiner scores Eugene's test, the results come back as inconclusive and very close to failure. A second examiner analyzes the test just for another opinion, and that examiner also scores it at near failure. They even check the results a 3rd time using an electronic scoring system as a reference, and that system scores the results as a failure. But ultimately, the test is deemed inconclusive. So Eugene didn't straight up fail, but he didn't pass either. Even when he's confronted with this information, he doesn't budge. Eugene says that he didn't kill his wife and he doesn't know who did. And he even agrees to take another polygraph. True to his word, he's back with investigators on January 22nd for round 2. Eugene and the examiner cover a lot of the same ground during his pre-test interview that they did the first time. And his theories haven't changed either. He doesn't think it was suicide, he doesn't think it was another stranger attack because the dogs would have stopped whoever came at Charisse, and so on. He still believes the dogs could have done it accidentally. In fact, now he actually has a specific dog in mind. He thinks it's their male dog, Mayday, the one that liked to jump. So again, if Charisse had her gun in the coverall's pocket, Mayday could have jumped on her, caused it to fire accidentally, so on.
Oh, wait, back up for a second. I want to bring up something you said earlier, that the dogs weren't leashed when the police found them.
Mm-hmm.
Why didn't Charisse have the dogs on leashes if they were so aggressive?
I don't know, but her brother Keith says that the dogs never went far from Charisse and they always obeyed her. So, I mean, they could have been so well behaved that maybe she figured there wouldn't be any issues with the dogs going after other people or animals because she'd be able to control them. I mean, even the vet told Nina that the dogs were very responsive to Charisse's command. Now, again, in this interview, Eugene and the polygraph examiner also talk about Jane. Eugene says that she was his, quote, business partner, but that the one thing led to another, and they ended up starting an affair.
Did they really have a business together, or is he just referring to them working together at UPS?
Yeah, there's no elaboration on that in the affidavit, but remember, Deborah said that Charisse had just found out about some property that they, owned together. Now, Nina did find records of 2 real estate transactions between Eugene and Jane that took place before Charisse's death. One's from 2000, the other's from 2005. So it's possible that whatever business partnership he's referring to has something to do with these real estate transactions. Now, Eugene says that he and Jane kept doing business together after Charisse found out about their affair. They also kept having sex from time to time as well. But according to him, Charisse did not know that he was still romantically involved with Jane. He says that he's sure of that. Charisse thought it had ended.
But her Aunt Deborah says that she absolutely knew.
Right. The examiner asks Eugene about the life insurance in his interview as well, and Eugene admits that people will do some bizarre things for money, but he insists that wasn't an issue in his marriage, that as long as their bills were paid, they were satisfied. And he goes on to say that, if you think about it, $450,000 really isn't a lot of money.
To who?
Yeah, I was going to say, we have different ideas of a lot of money.
Yeah.
Eugene says that basically after all the expenses, like Charisse's funeral, paying off their debts, that he only had $75,000, $80,000 left.
Only.
And after that, only. And after that, he tells investigators it's not enough money to kill someone over.
And how much did her funeral cost?
Well, he tells police that it was over $75,000, but they later find out it was it was exactly $22,241, which still a lot of money, don't get me wrong, but way off from what he said.
Yeah, that's kind of a lot to be off by, not just a few bucks.
Yeah. Now, ultimately, the second polygraph test is a lot like his first one. The examiner asks Eugene if he shot Cherise and also if he participated in her shooting. And he gives the same answers, no, all down the line. And once again, the results are inconclusive, close to failure. So even though they're not admissible in court, the polygraph exams are helping to focus the investigation, which is what Detective Norvell hoped they would do. And the focus is steadying right on Eugene. The more police learn about him, the more they suspect that he murdered his wife. But Eugene, he is still keeping secrets, and this is only the beginning. As investigators pull together phone records and wait for lab reports, they plan for one more polygraph exam. Only this time, it's going to be Jane in the hot seat. I'm going to tell you about that in part 2 of this episode, which is available right now everywhere you listen. Hi, friend junkies. I'm your host, Ashley Flowers.
And I'm Britt.
And we're back with the second part of our story about Cherise Walker Bingham, the Indianapolis woman who was shot and killed while walking her dog in White River State Park on December 12, 2012. Now, if you didn't hear part 1 of this, go back and listen before this episode or nothing is going to make sense, and I am about to drop a lot of spoilers.
Yeah.
This is your chance. When we left off, Cherise's husband, Eugene Bingham Jr., had become the main focus of Indiana State Police as they tried to figure out how and why this happened. By the end of January 2013, the investigation is in full swing. Eugene has been interviewed by police multiple times and has even taken 2 polygraph tests, both of which were inconclusive but close to failure. And at this point, police know about Eugene's longtime affair with a woman we're calling Jane. And they're also well aware that Eugene stood to gain $450,000 from Cherise's 2 life insurance policies. But they're about to find out a whole lot more. When the full results of Cherise's autopsy come back, investigators learn that the single gunshot that struck the right side of her chest and killed her was of indeterminate range, meaning they can't tell just how far the gun really was from her body when it was fired. But according to an affidavit written by Indiana State Police Detective Lester Norvell, the autopsy results are inconsistent with the idea that the gun went off accidentally while in Cherise's front coverall pocket. And they're also inconsistent with the gun falling or being dropped and hitting the ground. Remember, Eugene has 2 main theories that he shared with police. The first is that one of their German shepherds might have jumped on Cherise and somehow caused the gun to discharge while in her breast pocket. And the other is that she might have just dropped the gun.
So that's the end of those theories then?
Well, to some degree, but nothing is certain. I was talking to a detective that I know about this, and he said that inconsistent basically means more than likely it didn't happen that way, but never say never kind of thing.
Okay, I guess that's fair.
And along the same line, Cherise's manner of death is labeled undetermined, pending the results of the police investigation. Basically, they can't rule something a homicide until police show legit proof that it's a murder. Now, there's no way of knowing exactly what time Cherise was shot. There were no eyewitnesses to the actual shooting, and police can't find any surveillance footage of the area to help them pin down Cherise's movements. But investigators are able to build a rough timeline for the night of the shooting. Obviously, they know Eugene's timeline is wrong since he says Charisse left the house around 7:30, 7:45 at night, an hour after her body was found. Instead, detectives think Charisse left her house around 6:20 p.m. It takes about 8 minutes to drive from her home on Kessler Boulevard North Drive to North White River Parkway, where she had parked her SUV before the walk. And there was apparently a witness who saw a black female with 2 dogs in the area right around the time she would have been getting out of her car.
So that would have been like right before 6:30 p.m.
Right. Charisse's aunt Deborah McMurray told us that a friend of Charisse's also saw her that night in the same area around the same time. Charisse's death certificate lists the time of her injury as 6:39 p.m., but that's probably just the time she was found by the cyclist walking the trail because first responders were dispatched 1 minute later. So all things considered, she was probably shot right as she and her dogs were just starting their walk. But here's the absolutely horrifying thing. The Marion County Coroner's Office says that Charisse probably lived for 7 to 10 minutes after she was shot.
Oh my God. So she didn't die right away?
No, and if that's the case, it could explain why her cell phone was on the ground next to her, flipped open.
Like she was trying to call for help?
Yeah, that's what police think. They assume that her phone was out and opened up because she had tried to call for help. If what Eugene says about Charisse rarely having her cell phone on is true, then she would have had to power it up before she could actually use it, which would have taken at least a minute or two. But police can only speculate that she tried to call 911 because her phone records don't show any activity in that time window. In fact, Detective Norvell says that there wasn't much activity in general. So Eugene's claim that Charisse didn't use it on a regular basis probably is true. Eugene's phone activity, on the other hand, is a different story. So remember how he told investigators during his first formal interview that he hadn't deleted anything from his phone or his call history or whatever?
Yes. Let me guess. That's not entirely accurate.
Bingo. When police get a look at his phone records from Sprint, they realize he deleted 9 calls from December 11th through December 12th, the day Charisse died. And one of those calls was from Charisse's chiropractor, who was also friends with her and Eugene. Apparently, the chiropractor called Eugene on December 12th at 7:41 p.m. because he had heard about a woman's death on the news and wanted to make sure it wasn't Charisse.
Wait, who jumps to that conclusion? I have never once heard about a death in Indianapolis and been like, oh my goodness, I bet it was Ashley.
Fair, but it was actually because of a specific detail in all the news coverage. They had actually mentioned that there were these 2 dogs who seemed to be protecting the body of a woman found walking on a trail at White River State Park. Now, unfortunately, most of the web links for news articles or videos from that night don't work anymore, so I don't know what specifically the chiropractor heard or read or saw on TV, but I guess whatever it was made him immediately think of Charisse and her dogs. Anyway, when the chiropractor made that call, Eugene's phone pinged off of a cell tower to receive it. And that ping didn't hit on the tower closest to his and Charisse's house, which is where he said that he was at the time. Instead, it pinged off a cell tower in the area surrounding Charisse's body.
Oh, and did Eugene say anything interesting or sound weird or different when he talked to this guy?
Well, Eugene didn't actually answer that call at all. But having a record of him being away from his house during this time when he swears he was home is a big deal for investigators, especially because the call had been deleted on purpose, and Eugene lied about it, and he had already told authorities that he was the only one with access to his cell phone. So he says he didn't loan it out to anyone, it was in his possession.
So if anything got deleted, it had to have been deleted by him.
Mm-hmm.
Now, before I go too far down this Eugene path, exactly how reliable is this cell data? We've seen it work kind of in both ways in other cases before, and you did mention that the Binghams don't live that far from this trail. I mean, is there a chance that the cell tower his phone pinged off of could also be near their house?
So that is a good point, but there's an explanation in the affidavit that makes this a little clearer. I don't even want to try and paraphrase it because it's so complicated, so Britt, I'm going to have you actually read it word for word.
Okay, Detective Norville writes, quote, "As it was explained to me, the tower Eugene's telephone hit off of is located east of the couple's home near 18th Street and Kessler Boulevard North Drive, and even further east of the tower his telephone would normally hit off of. if he were home when he received the call. There is a possibility the call would have skipped the tower closest to his home and hit off the tower that it actually hit off of. However, if that had happened and he were home, it would have hit off the sector that faced west in the direction of his home. The call in this case hit off the sector facing south, which covers the area where his wife's body was found. The information has been verified, and the verification shows his telephone is definitely not at his home where he has consistently said he was at the time, sleeping. End quote. Okay, that whole thing was kind of legalese gibberish to me.
Fair. So again, I wanted you guys to hear like how it was written. The way I understand it is that, okay, there is a scenario where it would skip off like the first tower and go to the next one. But if it did that, if he's home...
So like if the tower has 4 sides, it would hit a particular side versus a different side.
It would hit off of the sector that faced west in the direction of his home. But his hit off of one that was facing south, which actually covers the area where his wife's body is found. So even if he's home, even if the first tower, whatever, it skips over that one and goes to the other one, it should be a different part of that tower. So still, his story doesn't seem to be lining up. Now, the call from the chiropractor is just one of the 9 calls Eugene deleted from his phone after Sharice's death. Unfortunately, we couldn't get much information from police about the other 8 calls. But according to the affidavit, during a discussion with investigators about the deleted calls, Eugene mentions that phone call that he made to Sharice as he was leaving their house to go look for her. So, again, reading between the lines, to me, that at least implies that Eugene counted that among the deleted calls.
But he had already told police he had called her, right? Like, why would he delete a call that he had told them about?
Well, if he deleted it, I think it's because the timing of the call didn't match up with the timing of the rest of his story, maybe. Remember, Eugene says that when Sharice took Mayday and Tsunami on their walk, that he stayed home, watched the game, dozed off, woke up 9:15, 9:30, realized she wasn't home, and Eugene says that he called Sharice's cell phone from their landline. Then he went out to look for her, calling her again from his cell phone as he left their house. So all of those little details and times he mentions are really important because Eugene says that he's sure that when he started looking for her, Sharice still had time to go to work for her 10:30 p.m. shift. But the phone records show that when he called her from their landline, it was 11:02 p.m. And when he called her from his cell, it was 11:09 p.m. That's like an hour and a half after he claims that he woke up from his nap, and it definitely wasn't before her shift started.
Yeah.
So when police ask him why there's this gap of time when he says that he woke up and when he's making these calls, he says that the timestamps of the calls just can't be accurate. Like the records must be wrong. And he says, by 11:09 p.m., I'd already spoken to detectives. I knew my wife was dead. But that's not true either, because according to the detective's report, Eugene pulled up to Sharice's car at 11:23 p.m.
And he said he stopped at 2 other places to look for her before checking White River State Park, right? Like, do we know how long it would take to check all 3 places?
Based on the distance from their house to each of those locations, we figured out that the route he most likely would have driven takes about 16 minutes. So theoretically, if he left his house right after he made that landline call at 11:02, he could have checked all of those places by 11:23, but it's a pretty tight window.
And you have to imagine, when he's stopping, he's also searching at least a little bit, right?
Potentially. I mean, again, all that's making assumptions, but hang on, because we're not done with the phone records just yet. It turns out that Eugene and his longtime girlfriend Jane called each other, wait for it, 110 times from December 3rd through December 11th, 2012.
Okay, Ashley, I'm going to be honest. I'm not going to say I haven't made contact with a significant other that many times in a short amount of time. I will say I was more than likely 14 years old and completely out of my mind in love with someone.
Yeah.
And 14.
That's a lot of times.
Way too many times. Especially right before your wife dies. What?
Yeah, let me break it down even further. So during that week leading up to Sharice's death, Eugene called Jane 38 times, and she called him 72 times. But, interesting fact, do you want to guess how many times they called each other on December 12th, the day Sharice was shot and killed?
How many? I'm afraid if it's more or less, to be honest.
0.
What?
Yeah, none. And that really sticks out to police because clearly Eugene and Jane talk on the phone a lot. Detectives want to know why they would call each other so much in the days leading up to the shooting, and then on the day of, just like stop cold. Plus, the calls pick up again after the shooting. Jane called Eugene 9 times on December 13th, but then they go radio silent again from the 14th through January 17th, 2013. There's only one call which Eugene made to Jane on December 27th.
Okay, so at this point, are police thinking that Jane was involved too?
Well, detectives want Jane to take a polygraph of her own. And so on February 8th, 2013, she does. There isn't a ton of information available about the interviews that the investigators conducted with Jane on the day of the polygraph. But we do know that she's asked 3 relevant questions. And here, Brett, I'm going to have you read them this time.
Quote, 1. Did you shoot that woman? 2. Were you the one who shot that woman? And 3. Did you participate in the shooting of that woman? End quote.
Jane answers no to all 3 questions, and she fails. Even after failing her polygraph, Jane insists she's telling the truth. But she doesn't give police any additional information, and since investigators have literally nothing else to hold her on, she's free to go. Later that day, detectives get a call from a lawyer who says that he's representing Jane. So that's the end of that. No more interviews with her. While police are obviously suspicious of Jane, it still comes down to the dogs. If Sharice's own gun was used in the shooting, and they're thinking Jane in this scenario, they can't figure out how Jane would have been able to disarm Sharice and kill her with Tsunami and Mayday right there. And that's something that Sharice's family can't stop thinking about either. Here's her brother, Keith Walker, who you heard from in part 1.
It still leads back up to him because of the dog. It all revolves around the dog. Because nobody could get close to her with the dog, unless it was him.
According to Detective Norvell, a quote, reliable source told police that Jane was deeply afraid of dogs. So it's hard for them to imagine that she's the one who pulled the trigger. Now, here's where another twist comes in. Police already knew that Sharice had 2 life insurance policies worth a total of $450,000. But after the polygraphs, they find out about a 3rd policy. This one is worth $410,000.
Oh my God.
And Sharice got it through her job at Pepsi when she started working there in June 2012.
So altogether, we're talking about like almost $1 million.
Yep. And $860,000 seems like a lot of life insurance. Again, especially considering all the things we talked about last episode. They didn't have any kids. Now, they were paying 2 mortgages, one on the house that they lived in and another on a duplex that they rented out. But even with those mortgages, this is a significant amount of money all going to Eugene.
So how did police find out about this 3rd policy? I mean, it doesn't sound like Eugene brought it up during those polygraph interviews.
So I don't know if police were notified by Pepsi or by Pepsi's insurance company, which is Minnesota Life, but it wasn't Eugene who told them. Now, in fairness, we're not sure exactly when he found out about the policy. I would think Sharice told him about it when she got it, but I don't know that for a fact. We couldn't find anything documenting that. So according to civil court records, Detective Norvell notifies Minnesota Life on February 23rd, 2013, that Sharice's death is being investigated as a homicide, and Eugene Bingham Jr., the named beneficiary of the policy, is a suspect. Now, a couple of weeks later, in March 2013, the state police lab conducts ballistics testing on the gun found at the scene and compares it to the bullet from Sharice's body. And they officially confirm what everyone has kind of assumed from the start, that Sharice was killed with her own gun. Lab technicians do a trigger pull test, which helps determine how much force is needed to be applied to the gun's trigger for it to fire. And they find out that Sharice's gun required 10 pounds of pressure to fire it with a round chambered. Basically, the heavier the trigger pull weight, the more effort it takes to pull the trigger. And investigators say 10 pounds is actually at the heavier end of trigger pull weights. So this isn't a gun with a really sensitive trigger.
Okay, so did police test Eugene's skin or clothing for gunshot residue after the shooting?
No. So Detective Norvell says that as an agency, the Indiana State Police doesn't generally conduct gunshot residue testing because of how unreliable it can be. And also, the detective said that the lab didn't find any fingerprints on the gun. And not just like fingerprints of suspects. What's interesting is they didn't find Sharice's, they didn't find Eugene's, nobody's. There were also no fingerprints detected on the shell casing that was found at the scene or the bullet recovered from Sharice's body. And again, like, even if we found stuff, like, and say it was Eugene's, he already told police that he was the one who cleaned their guns, so he'd be able to explain that stuff away if it came up.
Right, and he had an identical gun of his own, so if they handled the same ammunition, it wouldn't have been out of the question.
Yeah, but like, for there to be nothing on there, doesn't that seem strange to you?
For sure.
So, meanwhile, Sharice's family is waiting for answers. Some of her loved ones have been suspicious of Eugene all along. Here's Sharice's aunt, Deborah McMurray, talking about Sharice, who, again, everyone called Reese, and Eugene, who everyone called Bo Peep.
What was your initial thoughts when you heard that she had been shot? Did you think it was like a random shooting?
No, first thing jumped in my mind was Bo Peep. That's the first thing jumped in my mind.
Has her family pretty much cut him off by this time?
Well, there wasn't much of a connection in the first place. Like, even though Sharice was married to him for nearly 3 decades, her family says that they were never all that close with Eugene. According to them, Eugene was not the most social person. He apparently spent a lot of time down in the basement of his and Sharice's home where he had sort of like this man cave set up. And remember, Deborah already didn't trust Eugene because of all the stuff she had heard from Sharice. But not everyone felt that way. Even though they weren't close, Sharice's brother Keith said that he initially tried to comfort Eugene until speaking with Detective Norvell about the investigation.
I didn't think nothing about him doing that. I think every day I call him to lift him up and pray for him. I did that for a while. You know, just man to man, just praying. What can I do for you? You know, stay strong. Just whatever came to my heart to say to encourage him. And then everything turned when the detective came in the picture.
Detective Norvell knows how badly the family wants justice for Sharice, and he shares what he can with Keith, trying to keep him in the loop. So her family does know about the suspicion surrounding Eugene.
Then everything changed. I stopped calling. And no more contact after that. I just left it alone.
So what about Eugene's family? Like, I guess I'm wondering if they were close to Sharice, if they were surprised to find out about Jane and all this stuff.
You know, I'm not sure what the deal was at the time of Sharice's death, but Sharice had listed Eugene's mother as one of the contingent beneficiaries on the first life insurance policy that she got. So that means if the money couldn't go to Eugene for some reason, his mom would get a share. So you got to figure that they must have been close at some point. But his family also knew Jane already. And I have no clue when they found out about the nature of Eugene's relationship with her, but our reporter Nina found a Facebook post from 2006 that shows Jane at some sort of reunion or gathering that Eugene's family held. So they knew she existed. Now, I'm not sure what Eugene's family knows about the investigation as it moves along. But in June 2013, police get some information that strengthens their case against Eugene when the lab's analysis of Sharice's clothing comes back. The lab had found defects like rips and holes and tears that were made by the bullet, which helped them determine the bullet's trajectory. And it turns out that the defects in the right sleeve of the top 2 layers of clothing were consistent with Sharice having her arm out in front of her, like in a defensive position when she was shot. So that puts the suicide theory to bed, once and for all. There's no way those defects were caused by an intentional self-inflicted gunshot because she wasn't holding the gun. So you would think by now, police are pretty sure that they have their guy. But as the months pass by and the 1-year anniversary of Sharice's death comes and goes, there are still no arrests. In March 2014, the Marion County Prosecutor's Office brings this case to a grand jury. But everything is happening behind the scenes, and the public is pretty much in the dark until the summer of that year. That's when the Indiana State Police announced that they've made an arrest in the shooting death of Sharice Walker Bingham. The person in cuffs? Her husband, Eugene Bingham Jr. But that is far from the end of the story. On Monday, July 28, 2014, state police asked Eugene to come to the district station so they can update him on their investigation. When he gets there, they serve him with an arrest warrant and charge him with 1 count of murder.
Why did it take so long to charge Eugene if they had all this evidence a year ago?
I don't know, because as far as I can tell, it's not like anything new happened right then, and there's nothing we could get our hands on that kind of lays out everything that happened during the investigation and when it happened. We just know that Eugene continued to be a suspect throughout the last few months of 2013 and into 2014 because of one of the life insurance companies that documented that. So to the people who were already suspicious, like Sharice's pastor, Bishop Charles McLean Jr., Eugene's arrest is validation.
Of course, you're innocent until proven guilty, but at the same time, it was one of those things where we're not surprised. I never got a good feeling from him at all. And I'm typically not wrong about that. It made sense to me. It made sense.
Eugene is sent to the Marion County Jail, but I don't know exactly how long he stays there. Keith says that he thinks Eugene's sister put up her house for collateral to get him out on bail around Labor Day of 2014.
The day that he walked out of that courtroom and they released him, that was the saddest day of my life.
So Eugene's family is sticking with him. What about Jane?
Oh, they were together. In fact, detectives found out from Jane that she and Eugene started seeing each other, quote, exclusively in February 2013.
What? That's like 3 months after Sharice was killed.
Yep. And what we learned is actually Jane was actually one of the people to testify for the grand jury. Now, grand jury proceedings are secret, but witnesses can discuss their own testimony. So I have to imagine that she told Eugene what she said, which apparently wasn't much because according to the affidavit, Jane didn't provide any new relevant information. Now, Eugene gives his sister power of attorney about a month after his arrest so she can handle any kind of financial decisions for him. He also hires a lawyer, a guy named David Hurley, and starts to prepare for his trial. But the murder charge isn't the only legal battle Eugene is facing. He petitions the court and becomes administrator of Sharice's estate. And once his request is granted, he files a civil wrongful death lawsuit against Eugene to try and keep his sister's life insurance out of his hands.
Quick question. Did Eugene also have life insurance?
So Detective Norvell says that police confirmed Eugene did have life insurance, but he's not sure if the amount was ever verified. He remembers multiple policies on both of them, though. Now, if Eugene is convicted of Sharice's murder, he can't collect the life insurance anyway, but nobody knows what's going to happen in the criminal trial.
Right. So as this trial gets closer, do you have any sense of what police think happened that night? Like, do they think that Eugene approached Sharice and they got into a fight or something?
Well, there doesn't seem to be a specific theory. Although based on the timing and the location of the shooting, it's kind of hard to picture a whole argument taking place. And this is a good time to bring something up. We asked Sharice's family and police if they thought domestic violence played a role in her death. Now, obviously, if Eugene did kill his wife, he committed the ultimate act of domestic violence against her. But, we were trying to get a sense of whether or not there was like a history of any physical abuse during their marriage. And everyone we talked to said no, like there's no record of any incidents. In fact, Eugene had no prior criminal record. Now, we know that doesn't necessarily mean anything. You can never really know what's going on in someone else's relationship, and you don't know what it looks like behind closed doors. And domestic violence is often one of the most underreported crimes.
Right.
But for what it's worth, the people closest to Sharice don't think that she was being physically abused. Ultimately, the courts decide to put the civil lawsuit on hold until a verdict is reached in the criminal case because, there might not be a need for a civil lawsuit. But 1 month before the trial is set to begin, Sharice's family gets a heartbreaking blow. The state of Indiana drops the case against Eugene.
Wait, what?
Yeah, the court grants a motion from prosecutors to dismiss the murder charge on August 10, 2015. According to the deputy prosecuting attorney, the state can't proceed with the case due to a lack of physical or corroborating evidence. But the motion also says that the prosecutor's office will refile the charge if they could get additional evidence against Eugene. Now, we have a copy of the motion to dismiss in the blog post if you want to read it, but it really doesn't go into a whole lot more detail. But we did get some more information from Detective Norvell. Now, remember how the cell tower data showed that Eugene's phone pinged off of a tower near Sharice's body when that chiropractor called him that night?
Yeah.
Well, I guess because of how calls are routed when they go specifically to voicemail, Sprint couldn't confirm the exact location of Eugene's phone. Essentially, Sprint couldn't say that for sure Eugene wasn't in the park area, but they also couldn't say for sure that he was either, which meant that they wouldn't testify to their own cell tower data in court. And the case against Eugene was always circumstantial. I mean, again, there's no eyewitnesses to the shooting, no confession from Eugene. With all things considered, including the cell tower data, the prosecutor felt the case was strong enough to charge him with murder. Without the cell tower evidence, they no longer thought so. And for them, it was a strategic decision, because if Eugene is brought to trial and acquitted, that's it. Indiana can never charge him for Sharice's murder again. By dismissing the charge without prejudice, the door is still open to charge him if the case can be made stronger with additional evidence. Of course, that's of small comfort to Sharice's family. So, with no murder charge hanging over him, Eugene files a petition to collect Sharice's life insurance. But there's still that wrongful death suit to consider. Eugene is represented by the same lawyer who handled his defense in the criminal case. He admits Sharice died of a gunshot wound, but denies that her death was a homicide.
Well, was it ever actually ruled a homicide?
Well, there's actually some question of that. 2 of the court records we found say that Sharice's death was ruled a homicide, and it was obviously considered a homicide when Eugene was charged with murder. And state police referred to it as a homicide even after the charge was dropped, at least they have in press releases. But officially, according to the medical examiner, Sharice's manner of death is undetermined. And when we asked if there were any other versions of the report, the coroner's office told us that that's the one, quote, available to the public. And that's really where the lawsuit comes in. You don't need the same standard of proof in a civil case that you do in a criminal case. During the summer of 2016, everyone's gearing up for this wrongful death trial. Like maybe the family can finally get some answers. But after a mediation session in the fall of that year, Keith actually agrees to settle the case with Eugene. Most of the terms of the settlement are confidential, so we don't know what specific reasons led to the decision. But we do know that the estate got $75,000, and we also know that the estate can't sue Eugene for her wrongful death ever again.
You know, I feel like a lot of times in these cases, they're settled because the family doesn't want to be put through all of that emotional turmoil of like actually going to trial for a civil case.
Yeah, totally. I mean, lawsuits can drag on for years. But even with the settlement, the wrongful death suit against Eugene gives us a window into the criminal case because there's a ton of documents filed for the civil case which are still available to the public, even though most of the criminal court records are not. And there are a lot of details in there, especially about Sharice's life insurance. Now, Eugene had previously told investigators that he took out 2 of the policies when he and Sharice first married. But based on the information in the court records, that's not true. Sharice first got life insurance in 1987, and the policy was for the same amount as the mortgage Eugene had just taken out a year before to buy their home, $36,500. What's interesting is that on that life insurance application, Eugene is referenced as Sharice's boyfriend, even though they had apparently been married for 2 years by then.
Oh, that is weird.
It is, and again, no explanation for it. It's a strange detail. Again, kind of like the pastor didn't know she was married. It literally could have been a simple mistake on the application. Who knows? And we actually checked records all over Indiana trying to find their marriage license and actually couldn't locate it, but her family says that they married in the Bahamas. Anyway, Sharice defaulted on the premium payments for that first policy a year after she got it, so the value of it dropped to just $36.50. But she didn't get the $250,000 policy until 2003, which doesn't line up with what Eugene told police. For the $200,000 policy, all we know is the amount and that it's from Allstate. Really, no info on it because it doesn't seem like anything was filed in court about it. And then, like I said earlier, she got the largest policy just 6 months before her death. Pepsi gives its employees basic life insurance equal to their salary, but she also opted for add-ons like accidental death and dismemberment benefit, which boosted it to 10 times her salary.
Oh, wow.
With no legal claims standing in his way, Eugene collects the life insurance proceeds, minus the money that goes to Sharice's estate and lawyers. And Britt, what do you think he does?
Honestly, at this point, do I even want to know?
Probably not. Well, for one thing, he gets his arrest record expunged. Because of the expungement and the fact that this is still an open case, there's almost nothing record-wise that's available to the public. The prosecutor's office gave us a copy of the charging information and Detective Norville's affidavit. They also gave us the motion to dismiss the murder charge, and those records have been helpful as far as, resource material. But of course, it's a far cry from everything that's been filed in this case. And that's not all. In April 2017, Eugene does something else that, for Sharice's family, just pours salt in their open wounds. That spring, Eugene and Jane get married. They also buy a house for nearly $500,000, according to property records. Eugene pays off the mortgages he and Sharice had on their own house and their rental duplex. He sells the duplex, but it looks like he still owns the home on Kessler Boulevard North Drive. As you can imagine, watching all of this unfold has been maddening for Sharice's family. Her sister-in-law, Linda Walker, and Aunt Deborah spoke about it during an interview with Nina.
They were together all these years, married together all these years. She never had kids. Lived a pretty decent life. Then all of a sudden she walked her dogs, which she did every day. Then she comes up dead. Her husband has no emotional feelings about how she died. It doesn't appear that he ever was even interested or cared what happened to her. Now her life is snuffed out. He's gone on, married to a mistress, living a better life than he did with her. And it's just so, it really is aggravating to the family to think about her life got snuffed out. Nobody knows how it got snuffed out.
Some insurance money.
And he's got all, and the money doesn't even matter. The fact it doesn't matter, but it's the fact of the matter that he is living a better life with a lady that he was dealing with the whole time. They pretty much were married. Mm-hmm. And her life is gone and nobody even knows what happened to her. It's mind-boggling. You see this kind of crap on television, but not real life. She had so many nieces and nephews and family members she never had an opportunity to spend time with. Her life was just taken too quickly. And nobody knows why. Nobody knows why, and we don't even know how. We just know she was laying on the ground,
in a pool of blood.
In a pool of blood, dead.
Deborah says Eugene came up to her at a grocery store one time. She thinks it was after his murder charge was dropped. She said he was basically pleading his case, like, listen, I would never hurt your niece. But besides that, Sharice's family hasn't had any contact with him in years.
I know this is a little bit on brand for us, but do we know what happened in Mayday and Tsunami? I was wondering if Eugene kept them, since you mentioned that police source who said that Jane was really scared of dogs.
Well, their vet, Dr. Greg Keeker, told us that the dogs were well cared for during the time that they were patients of his. And sometime in 2013, their records were transferred to another animal clinic. So that's the last we know about them. I don't know if that woman who called, we talked about in the last episode, got the dogs, if they were adopted out. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure. But around the time Sharice died, Eugene told police that the dogs were 8 and 4 years old. And I read that the average lifespan of a German Shepherd is usually 11 to 13. So, 9 years later, those devoted, protective dogs that were standing over Sharice's body have probably moved out, as I like to say. To this day, police believe that the right person was charged with Sharice's murder, but it all comes down to what can be proven in court. And there are so many questions we still don't have answers to. What's frustrating is a lot of those questions can only be answered by Eugene, and maybe Jane, but it's not like they're talking. Nina called and texted both of them multiple times. She never heard back from Jane. She did manage to reach Eugene, who told her he didn't have anything to say. And Nina told him, listen, we know what Sharice's family thinks. We know what the police think, but we want your side of the story too. And you're the only one who can tell it. Eugene's response was, quote, "That's good. Keep that side." End quote. Sharice's loved ones do what they can to keep her story in the public eye. Local media covers a vigil Keith holds for his sister on the anniversary of her death, right on the trail where she was shot. And it's a way to keep her memory alive, but it's also a reminder of all that they've lost.
We'll miss We miss her so much. I just want closure. I just want to know who did this to my father.
Indiana State Police are sure that someone out there has vital information that could help bring long-awaited justice to Sharice and her family. Their hope is that that person's conscience will eventually lead them to coming forward. Anybody with information, regardless of how insignificant it might seem, should contact Crime Stoppers of Central Indiana at 317-262-TIPS. That's 317-262-8477. That number can also be found on the blog post for this episode and right in the show notes. You can find all of the photos, documents, maps, and sources for this two-part episode on our blog post at crimejunkiepodcast.com.
And be sure to follow us on Instagram at Crime Junkie Podcast.
We'll be back next week with a brand new episode. Ashley Flowers.
And I'm Britt.
And the story I have for you today is one that actually came to us by way of a listener named Jessica from the UK. And it's about a boy rapidly becoming a young man and starting to carve out a bright future for himself, until a night on the town with his best friend changed everything. That was 25 years ago, and the mystery of his disappearance still lingers even today. This is the story of Damien Nettles. November 3rd, 1996 is a typical Sunday morning for the Nettles family in their cozy home on the Isle of Wight, just off the south coast of England. Now, Sundays aren't slow. It's never slow at their house. There are 3 kids in the house with a 4th just off to university. So Valerie and her husband, Ed, are up making breakfast and starting to work their way through their weekend to-do list. 9-year-old Melissa is in the living room watching cartoons, and their sons, 12-year-old James and 16-year-old Damien, are doing what teenagers everywhere are doing at 8:30 on a Sunday morning.
Yeah, sleeping.
Sleeping, you got it. According to Valerie's book, The Boy Who Disappeared, she hears James start to stir upstairs, and so she figures it's as good a time as any to get Damien up and at him too, before, the day gets away from him. So she sends Melissa upstairs to wake him up, a job she's thrilled to do because, little sisters. But not even a minute later, Melissa's back downstairs saying that Damien's not in his bed. And Valerie's like, what do you mean he's not in his bed? Are you sure? Did you check the bathroom? But Melissa's like, yeah, Mom, I checked the bathroom. I checked everywhere. He's not there. Valerie is puzzled more than anything because honestly, Damien has to be home. Where else would he be? So she walks up the stairs to look for herself, sure that Melissa must be mistaken. Only when she gets to his room, she realizes Melissa is right. Not only is Damien not there right now, it looks like he hasn't been there at all since he left the evening before to go out with some friends. The night before, Valerie hadn't heard him come home because she was asleep. They'd actually given Damien a few extra hours on his curfew, and Ed, being a good dad, tried to stay up and wait for Damien, but he ended up dozing off, which is literally going to be my downfall when my kids are teens because I am 86 at heart and love a 9 p.m. bedtime. But they're kind of starting to worry because this really isn't like Damien to miss curfew. I mean, maybe 5 minutes, sure. But even if he decided to spend the night at a friend's house or somewhere else or whatever, he would always call to let them know. So something feels off to Valerie. But she tells herself, okay, don't panic. He's not a little kid anymore. He's 16. He's grown up. Just stay calm. She figures he had to have decided to stay at his best friend Chris's place and just didn't call, maybe because he didn't want to wake them, which he actually did all the time.
Okay, well, that's easy enough to check, right? I mean, I assume she could just call Chris.
Well, that's what Valerie says, but Ed reminds her, hey, it's 8:30 in the morning, and they know the boys had been out late the night before, so he says, let's just hold off for a little bit. They're both feeling like there's a really good chance that he's just going to shuffle through the door in the next hour with an apology anyway. So they wait. Valerie spends the next hour pacing in front of the window, too distracted with worry to do much else. But in that hour, Damien doesn't show. Another hour goes by, and still there's no Damien. So that's when Valerie picks up the phone and calls Chris. It rings and rings and rings for what feels like an eternity before finally a groggy voice on the other end picks up and says, hello. And it's Chris on the other end. And this wave of relief kind of washes over Valerie just hearing his voice. And so she asks, hey, is Damien with you? But Chris says, no, he's not. Chris goes on to explain that they ended up bailing on the house party that they were going to go to, and then they went downtown to try and hit up the pubs for a bit before they ended up both just deciding to go home.
Wait, the pubs? Isn't he 16?
So yeah, they're both 16, but Damien actually looks older than that. He's already like 6'3", and so he had some luck before getting into the pubs on High Street, but he'd actually only have to pass for 18 to do that, because I found on drinkaware.co.uk that the legal age for purchasing alcohol in the UK is 18, but kids as young as 16 are even able to legally drink in restaurants and bars as long as they're with an adult of legal drinking age who can buy it for them. You know, stuff I don't know here in the US.
Wow, yeah, okay. So maybe it's not actually as brazen as it sounds for this 16-year-old to, try to sneak into a bar.
I mean, still pretty brazen, but just maybe not as pointless as it would be to try, like, pulling that off here in the US.
Well, and also, me at 16 looked about 13 and a half.
That's really true. Anyways, so that's what Chris says they were doing the night before, pretty much going door to door trying to get into one of these pubs, but honestly failing every single time.
So essentially they were just standing outside of bars for most of the night, if not the entire night.
All of it, yeah. And the weather was crappy that night too. It was cold and windy and raining. And Chris says that after an hour of striking out, they were pretty much over it and decided to head home. So they walked from High Street to Northwood Park, which is where Chris, I guess, went one way towards his house, and Damien went another towards the Nettles house. And Chris says that's where he last saw Damien, literally climbing the steps to the park on his way home. Valerie asked Chris if Damien was okay when he left him. Like, she figures, maybe he drank a couple of ciders that night at the house party or whatever, but she doesn't think he was wasted. I mean, he only had a couple of bucks on him anyway. But Chris says Damien was totally fine. And he tells Valerie, you know what, I'm going to make a few calls to some of our other friends just to see if they've heard from him. And so he goes and does that. And the minute Valerie hangs up the phone, she and Ed start making calls too. But one by one, they're told by friends and acquaintances and neighbors that no one had seen or heard from Damien. And this is when the what-ifs Valerie had been trying to ignore for the last several hours start to really take root in her brain. What if something happened to Damien on his way home? What if he hurt himself? What if after a few drinks and in the wind and the rain, he slipped and fell into the sea? What if he's out there alone, hurt, scared, calling out for help, but no one can hear him? So Valerie and Ed head out to look for Damien themselves. They travel the route Damien would have taken home, expecting at any second to see him lumbering down the street. They check downtown, they check the street his friend lives on, they check nearby neighborhoods, his old work, but they don't find him anywhere. By mid-afternoon, they're both so consumed with worry that they decide it's time to report Damien missing to police. Valerie and her daughter Melissa make the trip to the police station together, and honestly, just finally getting everything out of her head and into someone else's is just a huge relief. She's thinking, they're gonna know what to do. They deal with this stuff all the time. They're gonna find him. Except they don't spring into action like she expected them to. In fact, they don't even seem concerned at all that her child is missing. They essentially say, like, okay, well, we'll be sure to keep an eye out for him. And in this moment, I picture Valerie doing like a slow blink and like several beats of silence and then just saying like, okay, and? But the cop is like, and you should go home and wait for him. He basically tells her that this happens all the time with teenagers, and chances are he's just going to be back for dinner. We'll call you if we hear anything. Valerie, of course, pushes back on that. She says, you don't understand. He was supposed to be home. This is completely out of character. Something is wrong. But ultimately, what can she really do in that situation? She can't compel them to act. And frankly, there's still a nagging doubt in the back of her mind that they kind of fed into. Like, maybe they're right? These are the professionals. Maybe he will come home.
And maybe I'm just jaded because in all the cases we've covered on the show that start with a missing person, especially, a 16, 17, 18-year-old, where the police think they ran away, I'm not sure we have ever actually had a runaway.
No, because I think that would be a very short episode with a happy ending, and we don't get many of those.
Right. So is there anything in particular giving Valerie doubts? Like, I don't know, were there conflicts at home or with his friends, like a breakup maybe, or struggling in school, depressed, anything?
Nothing like that, no. Honestly, Damien is a good kid. I mean, yeah, he drank some cider underage from time to time. I was sneaking sips of raspberry vodka in my parents' basement when I was a teenager. Yeah, disgusting. But Valerie and Ed had never had issues with his behavior or anything like that. There was nothing going on at home. Everything at school was fine. He had a solid group of friends. He was actually seeing someone new, was quite smitten with her. If he was depressed at all, there was no mention of it in the source material. If anything, his older sister Sarah leaving home for university had driven him to really start thinking about his own future. According to reporting by Valentine Lowe in the Evening Standard, Damien was studying for his A-levels, which are essentially university qualifying exams you take in certain subject areas. I guess Damien really wanted to pursue marine biology after high school, so he needed a few of those A-levels under his belt to get him into post-secondary. So, yeah, all in all, Valerie had no concerns about Damien in that regard. But he is a teenager after all, and so who knows? There's little she can do at this point, so she and Melissa head home to do as the police suggested, to wait. By the time 7 p.m. rolls around, it's been 24 hours since she'd last seen her son, and she's desperate for an update from police, but they just don't have one. That's when she asks about a search, like, where are the tracker dogs? Maybe we should think about airplanes, helicopters maybe. But they tell her that the dogs won't be helpful in this wet and windy weather, and that there aren't any planes available. Oh, and they tell her, frankly, your phone calls are kind of irritating to us. Like, can you just please stop calling? And Valerie is taken aback, just as she had been that afternoon. But she still doesn't press too much because, again, who knows? Maybe they're right. Maybe she is being irritating and she's overreacting. Maybe it's just a matter of time before he just appears on the doorstep. But the next morning comes, and he doesn't appear on the doorstep, and police still aren't doing anything to help find him. So according to an article Valerie herself wrote for the BBC, Ed and James head out on foot, along with Valerie's dad, to start looking. And police are legit zero help still, but thankfully the community starts to come together for the Nettles family in a big way. They make posters, they get on the phones, they're going door to door, doing whatever they can to help find Damien. At the same time, Valerie starts to plot out Damien's movements on the Friday night that he went missing. Chris gives her even more detail, telling her that the two of them, along with Chris's younger brother Davey, left their house around 7:30 for this house party, which wasn't so much a party as like 7 people hanging out. It was 3 couples and Damien. Chris says that, it was kind of boring and the group skewed a little young, so he and Damien left shortly before 9:30 to go into town. He says they stopped along the way to buy a few bottles of cider, and then they took a ferry to West Cowes.
Hang on, so they left the island?
So, no, not really. If you actually look at a map of Isle of Wight, you'll see that the top third, maybe half of the island is actually split in 2. So to get from Chris's place in East Cowes to downtown, which is in West Cowes, they need to take a ferry, but it is not a big deal at all. I mean, we're talking like a 2 to 3 minute ride.
Okay.
Anyway, we ultimately know they couldn't get in anywhere, and they left, splitting up near that park entrance. Now, Chris hadn't actually seen Damien go any further than the entrance of the park. He just assumed Damien had gone home because that was the plan. And also, it was so crappy out weather-wise, like, why do anything else? But Valerie ends up learning that Damien had done something else. Because as word of Damien's disappearance works its way around the community, people start coming forward and saying they'd seen him back in West Cowes after he and Chris had parted ways.
So Damien went to all the trouble to leave the downtown area with Chris, even ferried back across again, and then turned around to come back?
So, no, actually, only Chris would have had to cross using the ferry to get home, and Damien wouldn't have needed the ferry to get to his house, and Chris only used the ferry after he and Damien had parted ways.
Okay.
But either way, it's still strange that Damien would even divert if the plan was to go home and to turn around and go exactly where they were before. So using witness statements and some surveillance footage that Valerie was able to track down from some local businesses on High Street, she starts to piece together the second half of Damien's night. And at least at first, it sounds like he just sort of did a 180 at the park and basically picked up where he and Chris had left off, going bar to bar trying to get in. And without Chris, who actually looked his age, Damien probably had an even better shot than earlier in the night.
I mean, not to mention, Damien's got this extended curfew, basically burning a hole in his pocket. Like, I remember what that was like, to have like that extra hour or two.
Mm-hmm.
So why would he want to blow all that by giving up at 10:30, especially if he's more likely to get in without Chris?
Well, yeah, I get that, but even if that's the case, what I don't understand is why bother even walking all the way back to the park with Chris? Why not just be like, okay, you want to go home, safe travels, man, I'm going to stay here and I'm going to, like, keep trying to get in the bars.
Yeah, but I wonder if he was, like, going through the motions of them both giving up, so he wasn't being the bad friend to be like, well, you can't get in, you go home, I'm going to stay here and still have a good time. Like, it's like a show of solidarity to say, like, yeah, let's just give up.
Maybe. Or, you know, maybe he was even walking back with him with every intention of going home, and then by the time he got to the park, he's like, again, to your point of his curfew burning a hole in his pocket, like, I'm here, I might as well at least, like, try again. I don't know. Either way, we know he turned around because Damien was seen just outside Harbor Lights Bar at around 11 p.m. Another witness put him outside the same bar at around 10 after 11. And then a third says that he saw a young man matching Damien's description in the pub's parking lot, interestingly trying to get into a car. Like trying the door handles, which, again, we know he didn't have a car. And so when I hear that, it makes me kind of think of, like, what the evil kids in my neighborhood do. You know how, like, I don't know if they do this near you, but they'll, like, blow through parking lots in neighborhoods trying all the handles in cars to see,
totally, yeah.
Yeah, which one's unlocked, what can they take from it, whatever.
But would Damien have done that? Like, tried to steal from a parked car? It seems, I don't know, like a real leap from the person you described earlier.
Valerie says it's super out of character for Damien, but after trying and failing to get into one more bar, the rest of Damien's night is pretty out of character too. You see, after being turned away at the latest bar, Damien hit up a late-night food place called Yorkie's Chip Shop. And a pit stop at Yorkie's isn't the thing that's out of character for Damien, but it's what Valerie sees when she watches the surveillance video from the shop that seems a little bizarre. And here, I'm actually going to play it for you. Okay, so the best place to start this video is at the minute 15-second mark. And there's a bunch of people in this tiny little chip shop when the video starts, and Damien actually isn't one of them. And then at 1:28, that's Damien walking in the door right there.
And does he know these people? Like, it seems like he does, like they're chatting and stuff.
Apparently he doesn't. I think it's just kind of like a friendly stranger small talk.
Okay, so one of the guys left just as Damien walked in, but he actually comes back in around the 1:40 mark, and it looks like he and Damien might be having a conversation. And honestly, if I didn't know better, I'd say they were on their phones. They're, like, looking down, but this is 1996. That's not happening. So maybe they're just getting cash out of their wallets or whatever so they can pay for their food?
I mean, to me, I thought for a second they were almost exchanging something, but, like, you can't see anything below the counter, so I don't know.
Right. And Damien starts talking to another one of the guys from that group. This guy has to almost put his ear to Damien's face to hear him, which, I mean, this video is incredibly loud, so I can imagine it's super loud in the shop. And this guy sort of walks around everyone to get closer and stands right next to Damien as they keep talking.
Okay, so I'm going to speed it up here for a minute, basically to like the 4:55 mark. And this whole time, it's just people shouting their orders, the Yorkie people taking payments, handing people their fries. Damien is essentially waiting for his turn for like several minutes. But he does keep chatting with others in the shop. And once you've hit play, it does at one point look like he's like really intently watching this one guy shake salt or vinegar or something onto his fries. Okay, and so now the place is like cleared out and it's Damien's turn. And if you can, it's so hard to hear this audio. Our listeners won't be able to hear it, but Britt, if you could listen and kind of give everyone a clip of what he's saying.
Yeah, I mean, it is incredibly difficult to hear, but it kind of sounds like he's trying to order a number 1, but the guy behind the counter can't really hear him.
Yeah, so actually what he's saying is 1, please. Like, I'll have 1, please. And the guy behind the counter is like, 1 what? And they do this back and forth, and eventually the guy's like, you want chips? And Damien's like, yeah.
I mean, he is in a chip shop. I'll have 1 doesn't seem that ambiguous to me.
Yeah, but and that's fair, but something about this interaction strikes the staff at Yorkie's as odd. In a BBC documentary called Unsolved, the reporters actually go talk to the owner who was there that night. And he says he remembers Damien being pretty out of it. He says it wasn't, like, drunk. This guy told the BBC that Damien's behavior seemed more like, quote, a drug effect. And even Valerie agrees that there's something odd about Damien's behavior. Like, he doesn't, again, seem drunk enough to be forgetting words, but then, like, there he is on video forgetting words.
Was he using drugs that night? I mean, did he use drugs ever? Did Chris mention anything about that? I'm not sure how, like, upfront he'd be to Damien's mom about it, or to anybody really at that age, I guess.
Well, Chris says, no, he didn't use drugs, we didn't use drugs. He says drinking, yes, but drugs, absolutely not. And listen, like, Valerie knew Damien used cannabis from time to time. They'd found some in his room once, but nothing harder than that, especially nothing that would make him act like he's acting now, nothing that would make him forget how to order French fries.
Right. But he walks to the chip shop at 12:34 a.m. on November 3rd, which means even if he and Chris hadn't used drugs, even if he and Chris had just been drinking, Damien had an hour, which is more than enough time for a 16-year-old to go from tipsy to incoherent, even just drinking.
So this is actually an important point. I'm glad you brought it up. The timestamp on that footage is actually showing an hour fast because the owner of Yorkie's hadn't shifted the clocks back for daylight savings time, which was less than like a week before this. So it's actually 11:34 when he walks in.
Oh, so not enough time to binge drink after all.
I wouldn't think so. Now, one thing I noticed is while he was waiting for his fries, he walks out the door and looks around from side to side on the street before coming back in, and then he gets his fries and pays. And when he gets his fries, it's weird. He salts them, he gets his change, then he just kind of stands there strangely, and then he salts them again like he forgot that he did it the first time, and then he leaves and he walks out of the little shop. Now, that sighting wasn't the last. And when he leaves the chip shop, things only get stranger. Later, a bus driver comes forward and says a boy matching Damien's description climbed onto his bus around midnight carrying fries and holding a camera. He asked to go to Cows, and the driver said, you're already in Cows. And he says the kid tried to take a picture, which didn't work, and then just thanked the driver and left, almost like he thought he made it to his stop, even though the bus hadn't moved at all. There was another witness who says they saw Damien getting off that bus, and this guy was sitting in his car waiting to pick someone up at the bus stop. And he says that Damien looked really, really out of it, kind of drugged or something. He says that Damien came up to his car and said, "They're watching us." And the guy's like, "What?" And Damien said it again, "They're watching us." And when the guy still didn't understand what Damien was talking about, he says the teenager walked around his car wiping rain off the windows and then just left.
Well, that's unsettling.
Right? Now, from there, no one seems to have seen Damien. But Valerie knows there must be more CCTV footage out there, and she's hoping maybe this is something that the police can actually help with, since they've done literally zero things so far. And in fact, this time they do help. Police review the footage from the city's cameras on High Street. And wouldn't you know it, Damien is on the tapes. Police ask Valerie and Ed to come down to see the tapes. And they're just a few seconds into the first one when the officer points and he says, "Okay, there he is. There's Damien." Valerie watches, looking at the grainy footage, but it's not Damien. She's seen him almost every day for 16 years. She knows her son better than anyone, the way he walks, his movements, and this is not her son. She tells the officer this, and he's like, "Are you sure?" And At this point, he's already been reviewing the tapes for hours, writing down all the places this guy had been and what time and who he was with, but he'd been tracking the wrong guy.
I mean, does this person just look like Damien?
Not even that to Valerie. The man on the tapes was shorter, stockier, not to mention she had provided a description of what Damien had been wearing that night to police. He'd been wearing a black fleece jacket with a gray collar, and this guy on the tape, the guy that police had tracked all over town, was wearing a brown jacket and a hat.
Oh, so shorter, stockier, and in completely different clothing. I mean, were they even using any of the description or information that she had given of him?
Doesn't seem like it. Valerie and Ed spend 2 hours with the officer painstakingly reviewing this footage, looking for the real Damien. And finally, they do spot him at 11:50 p.m., fries in hand, walking up the street toward the bus station. 12 minutes later, at 12:02, he comes back into frame, still carrying his fries, and Valerie watches him walk across the screen and out of frame. Now, that's the only for-sure sighting of Damien on the footage they've had time to review. But there was still a stack of tapes to go through from other cameras on the street, and police were going to have to go through that. They tell Valerie and Ed that they're going to send the tapes out to have them enhanced, and with any luck, it's going to help them map his movements after 12:02 a.m. So Valerie and Ed go back home, and slowly, for everyone but the Nettles family, things start to go back to normal. Though within a couple of weeks, they too are forced to get back to the business of life, even though nothing is normal without Damien. Their kids go back to school, Ed goes back to work, and life just continues on. The police investigation, though, if you can even call it that, does not. Though at this point, they are considering an alternative to their runaway theory. They're now thinking that maybe Damien fell into the sea and drowned.
What? Would he have any reason to even go near the water in the middle of the night?
No, I mean, he could have gone along the shore to walk home that night if, in fact, he had tried to do that. But remember, this is November. It's not like he'd be inspired after a few drinks to go for like a late night swim or something. But that doesn't mean he couldn't have unintentionally gone in. Bronagh Munro, one of the journalists who made that BBC documentary, actually wrote a piece that I found published in The Mirror, which is not a source that I normally use, but in this case it actually is attached to an extremely credible author. But anyways, Brett, I'm going to get you to read a paragraph from that story.
It says, quote, "The town of Cowes sits right on the edge of the Solent. At points, the high street where Damien was last seen is less than 10 seconds walk from the water's edge. It's one of the busiest waterways in the UK, with a complex tidal system. It was easy to assume at the time that Damien had simply fallen into the sea." End quote. But this is now weeks after his disappearance, right? Wouldn't his body have washed up if that was the case?
Yeah, or at least that's what the harbor master captain told Ed when he went down to talk to him. Bronagh Munro's article actually quotes the harbor master too, saying, quote, "We got the charts out and I calculated for them the tidal movements, the tidal sets and rates, as well as the possibilities in case he had slipped into the water. The Solent is complicated, but it is also well charted. I am certain that had he gone into the water that night, he would have been returned to the land." End quote. But despite this, police are like, nope, Damien went into the sea. We're sure of it. The end.
Okay, they've looked at this case for like 2 seconds. I'm sorry, what?
Yeah, and they're so sure that basically every time any little scrap of clothing even washes ashore, an officer comes by the Nettles house to see if it belongs to Damien. But it never does. And as the weeks turn into months, it feels more and more like Damien just walked out of that frame and vanished into thin air. Not a trace of him turns up anywhere on that island. No clothing, no camera, definitely no body.
So at this point, does the focus shift to foul play then?
Nope. Police pretty much have their two main theories about what happened to Damien. Either he fell into the sea and drowned, which is their primary theory, as far as I can tell, or, they think there's maybe a possibility that he ran away and is living somewhere on the mainland. So basically an accident or an intentional disappearance, but foul play, absolutely. But to be fair, no one was really considering foul play at this point, not even Valerie. You see, the Isle of Wight is just not that kind of place. It's safe, it's friendly, it's traditional. Everyone knows everyone, for better or worse. In her book, Valerie says that you can't even sneeze on the island without someone saying, bless you. So the idea that Damien could have met with foul play, and moreover that somehow no one saw anything or would say anything, just seems impossible. Valerie is certain that if there had been foul play involved, something would have come out by now. And within the first year of Damien's disappearance, things do start to come out. Valerie starts to hear whispers about what may have happened to her son. There's a rumor that he had been beaten up by a shady character after standing up for a friend. Another, that he'd been targeted, maybe even groomed by pedophiles and killed. Rumors that Damien had been dumped in the sea, buried in the foundation of buildings, fed to pigs. Even rumors that he had been chopped up and used as fishing bait.
Okay, there's a huge difference between no foul play and his body was fed to the pigs. What changed?
Besides the passage of time, I don't think anything. But the more these rumors circulated and bubbled up, the more Valerie thinks that actually there must be foul play involved in Damien's disappearance. As horrifying as that thought is, it's the only one that explains why he still hasn't turned up one way or another. So every time one of these stories makes its way to Valerie, she passes it along to police, who have not budged from their theory that Damien either went into the sea or ran away. And it takes over a year for police to even really consider other options. And it takes them a full 14 months for them to do anything about it. Finally, in January of 1998, that's when they do their first official police search. They take 2 days, dozens of officers, tracking dogs, the whole 9 yards.
Okay, but what are tracking dogs and dozens of officers supposed to do 14 months later? That's almost insulting.
Yeah, I don't think they're necessarily tracking his movements that night. I think they're more looking for where his scent had been at any point. They basically searched all these sheds and outbuildings of every house in the Nettles neighborhood and through the woods and bushes around what would have been Damien's path home that night. But still, would have been nice to do this a little sooner.
Yeah. So why now?
Well, they tell Valerie that the impetus is new information, but they won't tell her what that information is or how they even got it, where it came from, nothing. And ultimately, I don't know if it matters because this search ends up turning up nothing.
But it sounds like based on that search, the police feel like he made it at least out of the downtown area and got pretty close to home. Had they been able to map him on that surveillance footage you mentioned?
Oh, right. That. Were you wondering about it after 14 months? Cool, so is his family. And in late 1998, after 2 years of radio silence on the subject, Valerie decided to follow up with police to see what they were able to see, if anything, once they enhanced the tapes. But when she asked for an update, the officer says, oh, those tapes. Yeah, those tapes are lost.
They got lost in the mail when we sent them to be enhanced, right?
No, not lost in the mail. He tells her that the footage was lost, that apparently they left the tapes in that player that day when they were all watching them, and they got reused, just taped over.
Oh my God. So they'd never been enhanced, and the family had never been notified that this just didn't exist anymore, the footage was gone.
Yeah, not only were they not enhanced, I'm not sure that they were ever even watched, to be honest.
Right, they were still in the VCR.
Yeah, so if there was anything relevant on those tapes, no one may ever know. Even more infuriating, though, is even that footage from Yorkies, police still haven't even done anything with that. It takes them months to even start trying to identify the other men in the video, the one that Damien was speaking to, let alone actually talk to those guys. All in all, as time goes by, all those little bits and pieces of swirling rumors about drugs and confrontations and murder, they all start to kind of converge and align. And the theory, for lack of a better word, that comes together as a result paints a surprising picture. Not just about what might have happened to Damien, but about Damien himself. In 2007, a private investigator named Ivor starts working on Damien's case. And as he digs and digs, he keeps hearing the same names over and over. Names that belong to the island's most notorious drug dealers, and rumors that Damien had gotten tangled up with them the night of November 2nd, 1996. The PI gets a tip from an anonymous source saying that Damien was outside a known drug house that night shouting, "I want some fucking drugs. Sell me some fucking drugs." This angered one of the guys in particular, and it led to a confrontation, and somehow that confrontation ended in Damien's death. It's variations on this basic story that keep looping back to the PI and Valerie, and to police, always with the same series of names, the same handful of people. And they're all part of this seedy underbelly of drug dealers many didn't even know existed on the island. And one name in particular is always at the center of it: Nikki McNamara.
Now, when you say drug dealer, do you mean these guys sold pot, or are we talking some harder stuff?
Well, they sold everything, including the harder stuff: meth, heroin, pills, you name it. And like I said, Valerie knew her son at least dabbled in cannabis, but there was no indication of any other drug use. And his parents are under no illusions that they knew every single thing Damien did, which is why, back when he first went missing, Valerie kept asking Chris, like, were you guys using drugs that night? Was Damien using drugs? Is there any way he could have used drugs? Maybe you didn't know about it.
Right, like, I don't care at this point. I just want my kid back.
Exactly. She was pleading with him for information. Like, again, you're not going to get in trouble. Like, this has nothing to do with it. Just help us, like, get to the answers. But he remained adamant all the time that they weren't using drugs that night, and he said that they never did for that matter. And listen, they didn't just press Chris when Damien went missing, they kept going back to him over the years. Because again, they're 16. You can be terrified. Someone says you're not going to get in trouble, you can think you're going to get in trouble. But they're hoping, okay, if he's older, maybe he'll be more level-headed, maybe it'll inspire him to open up more. But his story never changed. But neither did this rumor about Damien and the drug dealer.
Okay, so clearly if this guy is a notorious drug dealer, then he must be on the police's radar. Did they at least look into him?
Well, not when he was alive, as far as I know. You see, Nikki McNamara died back in 2002 of an accidental drug overdose. At least, that's how the coroner ruled it, despite the fact the fatal dose had been injected into his back, and he was dead in a bathtub for like 2 to 3 days in a house with at least one other person in it before he was found.
Well, okay, so he clearly isn't going to confess to anything, but just because he's dead doesn't mean he can't be investigated.
Oh, totally. I can't say for sure whether or not police investigated Nikki specifically, but they were certainly doing something, because nearly 15 years after Damien's disappearance, on an otherwise quiet Tuesday morning in May, police make an incredible announcement. And here, Britt, I'm going to get you to read it from the police news release published on The White.
Quote, police investigating the disappearance of a teenager on the Isle of Wight are taking action in response to information about the case. Damien Nettles, aged 16, of Woodville Road, Bernard, Isle of Wight, went missing on Saturday, November 2, 1996, after a night out with friends. Hampshire Constabulary's Major Crime Department is following leads established over the past year about what could have happened to Damien. 5 people were arrested on Tuesday, May 10, 2011, on suspicion of murdering Damien Nettles in 1996. These 5 suspects are being questioned by detectives at a number of different police stations across the island in Hampshire. End quote. What? I mean, are these the guys from the chip shop video?
No, they aren't, no. And actually, it comes out around this same time that police had finally identified those guys on the video as soldiers in town for some kind of training exercise. They weren't actually from the island. And
so no one would have known them. Might have been why, like, Damien struck a conversation with them, stuff like that.
Sure. And they say that, listen, they were able to talk to him. They had nothing to do with Damien's disappearance. The guys that they're talking about in this press release, they're locals, and they range in age from 37 to 50, but they don't name the suspects. And they ask that the media and the public not to name them either, even though I'm sure everyone on the island knows exactly who these guys are, where they live, who their parents are. I mean, again, this is a teeny tiny town.
Right.
So police held these guys overnight for questioning, but all 5 were ultimately released on bail the next day. But as part of this, police do another search, and this time they're clearly saying that they're looking for remains, though they do temper everyone's expectations by saying we really don't know if we're going to find anything. And that's because still, even to this point, all the information out there about Damien's whereabouts that night is still just rumor, which so far has meant a lot of dead ends. And I want you to read one more paragraph from that release.
Quote, there have been false and malicious allegations about possible burial sites for Damien's body over the past 14 years. Such unfounded speculation has upset the Nettles family and wasted police time and resources. Therefore, careful consideration has been given to our decision to examine this marshland. It is important for the community to keep expectations for this search in perspective. We cannot guarantee that anything will be found at this stage." End quote. And I assume when they say false and malicious allegations and unfounded speculation, they're referring to all these rumors that have been swirling around that you mentioned earlier, that he was thrown out to sea or buried in a foundation or fed to pigs or whatever.
Yeah, that's what I think. And the other thing I think is that they're trying to signal here, like, hey, unless you actually know something, like saw it with your own eyes, heard it with your own ears, don't bother spreading it around. In a place like Isle of Wight, it takes no time at all for one person's drunken whisper to snowball into like a full-on chorus. So they're saying, like, again, it might seem cool to share something you heard from a friend of a friend of a friend and pass it off as fact, but not cool. It's like not helping us in any way.
Yeah, and not just not cool, like actively keeping the investigation from actually making progress.
Totally, right.
So do they find anything in this search?
They do find stuff. They find car parts, bricks, handbags, cell phones, bottles, but no body. And even all that stuff that they found, none of it is relevant to Damien's disappearance. The upside, though, is that they are confident, based on how detailed the search was, that he is not in that location.
So we don't know where he is, but we know he's not here.
Exactly. Now, just before the 15th anniversary of Damien's disappearance, 2 more people are arrested. This time, a 44-year-old man and a 35-year-old woman, and police execute yet another search. And this time on a residential property. The BBC's Unsolved documentary describes this as the chalet of a dealer, and police go through every inch of it, inside and out. They dig up the backyard, they bring in cadaver dogs, but again, they find no evidence of human remains. And again, the people who were arrested are released. Friends of the Nettles family spent years, literally years, doing their own private search of a wooded area Damien is rumored to have been buried in. Now, police refused to get involved in that one due to a lack of credible information to point them there. And as far as I know, it hasn't turned up anything. There have been a few tips and stories that have come forward over the years that seem to corroborate the theory that Damien got tangled up with Nikki McNamara that night, but everyone who knew Nikki back then insists that they know nothing. Interestingly to me, only one of Nikki's friends ever really says he thinks Nikki didn't do it. The rest are like, Nikki was a bad dude, but I don't know anything.
Glowing review.
Yeah, right? Now, despite the sizable rewards that brought some people forward, police have not received anything they can substantiate. There have been no more arrests since those in 2011. There have been no more police searches. Nothing. Which means Valerie and Ed and their 3 remaining children are still just waiting in limbo.
I can't help but wonder how this case might have been different if police had just investigated Damien's disappearance as soon as he was reported missing. Like, if they had spoken to people right away, before they had a chance to, put their heads together or find a story.
If they hadn't erased the tapes.
Yeah, or threaten each other, or hold each other hostage with information and stuff like that. It's just so frustrating to know that they basically sat on any chance to help for 14 months before they even, did a thing.
Yeah, I think so much was lost by not treating this how it should have been treated from the get-go.
Seriously. Treated it seriously.
Yeah, and one of the tips/rumors that has gone around about that guy, Nikki McNamara, was that he was burning something in his backyard the day after Damien disappeared. Now, I don't think it was substantiated at all, but to be honest, the idea of someone burning a body in broad daylight right after a kid went missing, it seems to me too risky for a seasoned criminal. But it could be true. Stranger things have definitely happened.
I also think of, I don't know the weather patterns of the UK at all, but November here in broad daylight isn't always broad daylight. It's cloudy, it's dreary, they live on this little island. We know the weather had been bad the day before. Maybe it wouldn't have been that odd to see someone, burning their trash that day in the broad daylight or whatever.
I mean, at the end of the day, I think what's frustrating is that we even have to have this conversation. That would have been really easy to check out, the week Damien went missing, the day after Damien, when his mom showed up.
Right, exactly.
Ultimately, the police didn't even do the bare minimum in this case. Back in 2016, Valerie actually submitted an official complaint against local law enforcement for all the ways they dropped the ball in Damien's case. And listen, I know we talked about a couple of those things today, the failure to act, the lost video evidence, but there is so much more. This case was bounced from officer to officer. Notebooks and logbooks were destroyed without information being logged in their system.
I mean, not to mention the way they treated Valerie, like telling a worried mother to stop calling because she's irritating them.
That too. You know, at one point, you're not even believe this, they actually called her a hysterical woman.
No.
Mm-hmm.
No.
And in her complaint, Valerie said that the way the case was handled destroyed the family's confidence in police. And even the police themselves, at least now, are like, yeah, we get that. And they apologized to the Nettles family, but apologies can't wind back the clock. What was lost is now lost forever because of the people who were there before. I want you to read just one last thing for us, Britt. This is something Valerie said to reporter Sally Perry from On the White in 2019.
She said, quote, "With every passing year since we last saw you, we have never forgotten you. Sweet boy, you have been in our hearts and minds always. Your time with us was short, 16 years, but we were so lucky to have had you with us that long. In that time, you touched so many people's hearts who have reached out to us over the years. You were liked a lot. You were and are still loved, and you're missed by so many. Nobody can take that away from us. Your going missing and the ensuing years have been so tough. But because of you, we have become stronger than I believe we could have ever imagined. Nobody can take that away. We are still a family and made stronger. We mourn you every day, each in their own way, but you are sorely missed. One day, we will get the answer to where you are so we can bring you back home to our arms." End quote.
Valerie believes that the answers to her son's disappearance are somewhere on the Isle of Wight, even if the opportunity for truth and truly meaningful justice died in that bathtub with Mickey McNamara. But it is not too late to bring an end to this nightmare for them. It has been over 25 years since Damien walked off High Street and disappeared into the night. At this point, Valerie and Ed just want to know where Damien's body is, so they can lay their son to rest once and for all. If you have any information on the disappearance of Damien Nettles, check our show notes and the blog on our website for where you can send that information. For a list of our source material, you can visit our website, crimejunkiepodcast.com.
And be sure to follow us on Instagram at Crime Junkie Podcast.
We are actually off next week for the holiday. We'll be back the following week, but stick around for Prophet of the Month. Crime Junkie is an Audio Chuck production. So, what do you think, Chuck? Do you approve?
Okay, everybody. It's the last Prophet of the year, so it is not sad.
That's good news.
And this is the sweet Prophet story of Zia. But one reason I wanted to highlight the story was not because of just Zia, but because of how awesome her mom is, and also just like our listeners, because they're so cool.
Okay.
So Katie was in college. She lived with a whole bunch of roommates who had cats and dogs, and she loved it. But she was younger than them, and when they graduated, she didn't have all those pets anymore. Now, she knew she wasn't ready to take on a dog in her little college apartment, so she adopted a kitten named Izzy, who was a tiny bean when she came to Katie. For the first month, she only ate liquid kitten milk and had worms and was super sick, but nursing her back to health became Katie's mission in life, and she did it. Izzy is fine now and amazing. And a few years later, Katie met the guy who is now her husband, who was allergic to cats. And I say was because pretty sure he still is, but he fell in love with Izzy. And they are besties now. And the three of them moved from Philadelphia to New Mexico for a while. And they still weren't quite ready for a dog yet, But they went on tons of camping trips and hikes all throughout New Mexico, and they always helped the skittish dogs they'd come across on these trails near reservations, making sure they had food and water, and which is just like, just breaks my heart. And the family goes through another move, this time to Colorado, and they're finally ready to settle down with a puppet. But of course, the husband says only one that's good for Izzy. So they go to the rescue with this long list of requests, not expecting to get a dog that day because, they want the perfect dog for the cat, they want the perfect dog for their family, etc., etc. And then they meet a sweet little pup named Sue.
What? They went to the shelter and thought they were going to get a dog and end up with a dog? Didn't see that coming.
I know. I guess my stories are kind of predictable, but you guys, it just
You
keeps
guys
happening.
are predictable. You guys love them.
You all lied to yourselves all the time. It's not my problem.
That's what it is.
So they check out Sue. She's about 1.5 years old. She had just given birth to a litter of puppies, but she was, cleared to be adopted, and they go and take her into the little room, and Katie turns into a total puppet cuddle puddle. She's like, it's over, we're done. But the shelter can't really give them any information about how she'll do with cats. They actually got her from another state that had rescued her from a reservation in New Mexico. So Katie and her husband are doing the math, and they're wondering, this could have been a dog or related to one of the dogs that we helped on all of our camps and all of our hikes where we lived last.
No way.
And that just sold them on Sue, who they have now named Zia. She is an Australian Kelpie, which, fun fact, the oldest dog in the world was a Kelpie. So congratulations, guys. She's gonna live forever. And they get her home. She and Izzy are absolutely inseparable. They are besties. And again, great story, adorable story, super excited for this little family. But you guys, these people are heroes. So they have this dog, they have this cat, they're living their life, and all of a sudden, Katie sees this dog walking down the sidewalk who's limping. And she goes into hero mode, brings the dog home with her, and, starts posting on Facebook, calling shelters, and it's like, I'll just keep this dog for as long as it takes, or maybe just forever, even though I can't really maintain another 65-pound dog. I will. But they end up finding the dog's family and reuniting them. Then, one day, in her house, she hears this whimpering, all day, and she cannot find where it's coming from. It's not Izzy, it's not Zia, but it just keeps whimpering all the time. So she reached out to her neighborhood group and is like, I can't find where this is coming from anywhere. And they all are chiming in with thoughts and ideas. Some of them have heard it, some of them haven't. And finally, she and her husband go outside and they narrow it down to a sewer grate. And her husband pulls off the manhole cover, goes down into the sewer system, and rescues an elderly chihuahua who had fallen down there through the grate, on the sidewalk.
How teeny tiny is he?
Was hungry, was whimpering, and was hurt. They bring him home, take care of him. They eventually hand him over to the shelter, who finds him a perfect home in the neighborhood group that Katie originally reached out to. So this little guy is still in the neighborhood being loved on and taken care of.
Amazing.
And I'm just how have you rescued this many animals? I am floored. I am just amazed by these people. And Katie said, I hope that it can serve as a good reminder that we all need to stay vigilant, just like with our own safety, to keep all the puppets and kittens safe. If you see or hear an animal in need, go investigate, call your local animal shelter, and spread the word. A small act of kindness can save a life, and hold your babies tight. They count on us to protect them. And, guys, happy holidays! Cuddle Pup. And Katie also wanted to highlight the Humane Society of Pikes Peak region, which is where they got Zia. And we'll have their information as well as pictures of Zia on our website.
Happy holidays. Happy New Year, Crime Junkies. I'm your host, Ashley Flowers.
And I'm Britt.
And the story I have for you today is one that I wanted to tell in January for Stalking Awareness Month. It's about a woman who was stalked for over 20 years. But because stalking is so widely misunderstood, she wasn't even sure if what she was experiencing was even a crime. And by the time it escalated into something even more dangerous, the measures put in place to protect her life were too little, too late. Now, before we dive in, I do want to provide a bit of a disclaimer. The crime that I'm going to be talking about in this week's episode happened between the early 1980s and 2005. However, the perpetrator in this case has more recently come out as a transgender woman. Now, we always try and tell these stories in real time, like how it happened in the moment for the victim, for their loved ones, or for investigators, but we are also really mindful of the struggles of the transgender community that they face every single day, especially in the media. So although we're going to be telling the story as it unfolded, we will be using gender-neutral pronouns when referencing this person to avoid using her dead name as much as possible. And if the term dead name is totally new to you, or you're suddenly realizing that maybe you don't know as much as you'd like to about the issue facing transgender people, we're actually going to include some links in the show notes for today's episode that will hopefully be pretty helpful. And also, before anyone gets quick with the 1-star review button because we're being too woke or PC because you don't think a person who committed a violent crime deserves all of the care that we put into this episode, honestly, it's too early in the morning for that.
Yeah, like, you're taking shots at me like it's Patron, and I'm just like, damn. It's 7 a.m. And honestly, yes, guys, it pretty much is.
Yeah, but listen, it's not about them. My words, Brit's words, your words hold a lot of power. And there is an entire community of wonderful people who can be harmed if we all aren't careful with our words. So it's about showing love and respect to them. The world would be a whole lot nicer of a place if we all just showed a little more love and respect to one another, don't you think?
Oh,
so
totally.
With all of that said, this is the story of Mary Lynn Witherspoon. On November 14th, 2003, Jane Welchel is having a pretty ordinary day when she receives a really out-of-the-ordinary phone call. It's her mother's best friend, and she's calling to let Jane know that her mother didn't show up for work that morning. You see, Jane's mother, Mary Lynn Witherspoon, is a French teacher at a school in Charleston, South Carolina. And not only did she not show up to school that morning, but she didn't even call in for a substitute. And that's not like her at all. Like, Mary Lynn loves teaching. She loves her students, and she loves French. She wouldn't just not show up to school, especially without making prior arrangements. So right away, Jane knows something isn't right.
So had anyone tried to contact Mary Lynn or, gone over to her house to check on her?
Yeah, actually, according to Keith Morrison's reporting for NBC News, the school principal and another person on the staff had gone over to Mary Lynn's house. They knocked on the door, but Mary Lynn never answered. And they even took a look around the house and didn't see anything that really worried them, to be honest. Like, there's no broken glass anywhere, and Mary Lynn's car wasn't there. So at first, I think any normal person would probably be thinking that maybe she'd just gone somewhere on her own.
Except it's a school day, and that would have been completely unlike her.
Right. So her daughter Jane is panicked, and she's feeling really helpless because she lives 3 hours away from Charleston, so she can't even go over herself and just hop over to the house to see if there's anything wrong or look for her mother. So her mind is just jumping to all kinds of conclusions. So Jane and her husband get in the car and start heading to Charleston to get answers for themselves. But along the way, they contact police to report Mary Lynn missing. And luckily, this isn't one of those cases where police tell them to wait 24 hours or something like that.
Thank goodness.
They get to work immediately, and Jane actually gives them permission to enter Mary Lynn's home by force while she makes her way there. And that's what they do. Now, although Mary Lynn's colleagues didn't notice anything wrong when they checked the outside of the house, as soon as police enter, they come to a totally different conclusion. Because according to an Associated Press report published by the Item, when police enter, the house seems off. For example, they notice jewelry on the floor, as well as an apple, plus some food in the kitchen that looks like it was kind of just left there mid-meal. As they continue searching the property, they notice a broken spindle on a staircase leading up to the second floor. So that's where they head next, following this trail upstairs into Mary Lynn's bedroom. And when they walk in, that's when they really know something bad happened here. They see drawers are open, things have been rifled through, and there are clothes all over the floor.
So basically the place had been ransacked.
Pretty much. I mean, maybe you could look at it as if Mary Lynn had just left in a panic or something, but if that's what police are thinking, that theory is proven wrong as soon as they enter the second floor bathroom, because that is where they find Mary Lynn, dead in her bathtub. Now, obviously, this has immediately become a completely different situation for police. They're looking at a potential homicide now. So they get right to work processing the scene, and Mary Lynn's body is sent off for autopsy, where they find that her cause of death was strangulation. The results also note that she had been sexually assaulted and that her hands and feet had been bound with tape. Now, as soon as Mary Lynn's family learns what happened, they immediately point police in the direction of someone who they think could be responsible for her murder. And that person is Edmonds Tennant Brown IV, who we'll be referring to as Brown from here on out.
Okay, so who is this person?
Well, to answer that question, we kind of need to jump back a little bit. And I'm not talking just a few months here. We actually need to go all the way back to 1981. Back then, Mary Lynn was a single mom of one, just coming out of a painful, messy divorce. But she definitely didn't lack for interested men. In Keith Morrison's piece for NBC News, a family friend says that she had to basically beat off potential suitors with a stick, which maybe is to be expected considering this lady was a catch. Mary Lynn was super smart. She had become a really popular teacher. Parents, students, colleagues, pretty much everyone loved her. And on top of all of that, she had even won beauty pageants in the past.
Okay, so this lady is the total package.
Yeah, but one particular man caught her attention, and that was Edmonds Tennant Brown III. He was a single parent too. He had 2 children, and he came from a really prominent family in Charleston. And as you might expect, Edmonds and Mary Lynn were absolutely smitten with one another. And Edmonds also adored Mary Lynn's daughter Jane and really doted on her. In an interview with NBC News, Jane says that he would actually come over in the mornings after Mary Lynn had gone to work and would make Jane's breakfast for her and take her to school.
Okay, that is A+ boyfriend material.
Totally. But their relationship wasn't quite as picture perfect as you might expect. Because although Edmonds welcomed Jane with open arms, things didn't go quite as smoothly with his 2 children, a 9-year-old daughter named Molly and his oldest child, a 10-year-old named Brown, who I mentioned before.
You mean Mary Lynn wasn't welcoming to them?
No, the source material on this case all indicates that Mary Lynn was very good with Molly and Brown, but there were a couple of issues on the kids' part, really. One of the issues was that Molly and Brown seemed to be quite jealous of the attention Edmonds gave Mary Lynn's daughter, which I can totally see. That kind of a big change is really tough for a kid.
Oh, for sure.
But despite that, Brown really seemed to like Mary Lynn, and to her credit, she tried really hard to look past all the awkwardness and try to build a relationship with them. And remember, Mary Lynn was a teacher. She knew how to connect with kids, even challenging ones, and Brown was a little challenging. The source material is a little vague on this, but Brown is mostly described as awkward, someone who wanted to fit in but just didn't. So again, coming from a background of teaching, Mary Lynn had encountered kids like this before, and she wanted so badly to be there for Brown. But there were a few incidents early on in Mary Lynn and Edmonds' relationship that definitely made this more difficult.
Like what?
Well, according to an episode of Obsession, Dark Desires that covered this case, Brown would occasionally steal some of Mary Lynn's things, particularly her clothes and jewelry. And actually, Mary Lynn initially thought it was her daughter Jane who had been taking them, but Jane actually caught Brown wearing these items at least once, so it definitely created some tension. But the most troubling incident happened one day when Mary Lynn and Edmonds had the kids at the country club pool. At one point, Mary Lynn and Edmonds were sitting by the pool watching their kids play, and Brown was like, "Hey Jane, let's see who can hold their breath the longest." So Jane takes a deep breath and ducks under the surface. that Brown didn't join her. Instead, they placed their hands on Jane's head and calmly held her below the water. Luckily, Mary Lynn noticed this happening and was able to rescue Jane before anything truly terrible happened. And the thing about this is, it wasn't even really the act itself that disturbed Mary Lynn. She knew better than anyone that sometimes kids do stupid and dangerous things.
Right.
What really struck Mary Lynn was how Brown reacted afterward. How completely calm they were. They had no remorse whatsoever for what they'd done.
Yeah, that would be chilling.
Right? But they all moved on from that, and Mary Lynn and Edmund stayed together for a few more years. And there aren't a ton of details about what Brown's behavior was like during this time. It's definitely implied that things were still awkward, but just nothing as serious as the swimming pool incident. But either way, Mary Lynn just was never really comfortable with how their two families were blending. And so in 1988, despite Edmonds having proposed to her multiple times, Mary Lynn decided that it would be best for her and Jane if she ended her relationship with Edmonds.